Well, it's lovely to be out on such a sunny evening in Edinburgh, but it's a shame that we have to be out tonight protesting against the two-child cap and the rate clause. Well more than a year since Alison Thulis, my colleague at Westminster, first spotted it in the small print of a Tory budget.
Very glad to see such a huge demonstration today and so many people still coming along 1 year after the rate clause came into force to show their opposition to this vile and despicable policy. The UK government have never been able to justify this policy, and we saw that this week with Esther McVeigh's pathetic attempts to say that the rate clause was somehow double support for women and that gives them some kind of chance to talk about the most appalling and disturbing experience of their life.
As you can see behind me, we're at the very beginning of the All Under One Banner rally. You can obviously hear the pipers behind me as events are about to kick off.
It's time to aim high, look resolutely outwards, and never, ever accept second best. Above all, it's time to believe that we can. We can build that better country we know is possible. And friends, we will.
If you enjoy watching our programmes, please help us to be Scotland's independent broadcaster by signing up to become a Broadcasting Scotland supporter.
Wherever you stand, get the fresh view of what's happening in Scotland with iScot. Celebrate everything about our country with intelligent, in-depth insight from lifestyle, culture to puzzles. And all the opinions you'll need, whether it's digital or by post, subscribe now to iScot.
Good afternoon. Our first item of business today is Time for Reflection, and our Time for Reflection leader is Ms Lindsay Taylor, Muslim Council of Scotland and Board of Interfaith Scotland.
Thank you. Assalamu alaikum. I begin with the addressing and greeting of peace. In this moment of reflection, I would like to share with you how Islam as a religion has taught me to strive for goodness. How much of the work we do in interfaith is to come together with goodness, to share, to invite, and to learn more about one another. For me, Islam is a way of life in which every one of us has a part to play in making a better world. This can be seen in the Quranic verse 49:13. O mankind, indeed we have created you from male and female, and made you people and tribes, that you may know one another. Indeed, the most noble of you in the sight of Allah is the most righteous of you. Indeed, Allah is all-knowing and acquainted. The need to come together has been instilled in me from a very young age, through the eclectic mix of religions and beliefs in my family. A family that put interfaith and respect for one another front and centre. My uncle even jokes at family gatherings. A Muslim, a Jew, a Christian and an atheist all came together. They were all in my house and they were all very happy. Interfaith Scotland to me is a continuation of the need to respect and work together. My upbringing helped me to appreciate that there was more to each of us than what we see on the outside. In this, I wear my scarf as an expression of my faith and as a connection to Allah. Despite the funny looks that I often get, my faith gives me strength inside and out. It binds me to hope and to good actions for the benefit of all. The Prophet Muhammad, peace be upon him, said, "The best of people are those who bring the most benefit to the rest of mankind." I've learned that interfaith is about us coming together not just for good words, but also for good deeds and to make a difference. It's about giving back, working with communities that may be different from our own, but that come together to work in hope and in friendship. The Prophet Muhammad, peace be upon him, said, God is beautiful and he loves beauty. Islam has taught me this, a way of life that is beautiful in actions and words. Thank you very much for giving me the opportunity to speak today in the Interfaith Week. Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you. And our next item of business is consideration of Business Motion 19833 in the name of Graham Day on behalf of the Bureau setting out a change to today's business. Could I call on Graham Day to move this motion?
Moved, Presiding Officer.
Thank you very much. And no member has asked to speak against the motion. The question therefore is that motion 19833 be agreed. Are we all agreed? We are agreed. Thank you. The next item is topical questions. Our first question from Jackie Baillie.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. To ask the Scottish Government what discussions it has had with craft brewers about the deposit return scheme.
Cabinet Secretary Rosanna Cunningham.
Scottish Government officials have met with representatives of both the Society of Independent Brewers and the Brewers Association of Scotland to discuss the deposit return scheme. CEBA also sits on working groups discussing producer and scheme administrator issues. Zero Waste Scotland also hosted a workshop for small brewers on 25th September and has continued engagement with the sector, including the publication of a sector briefing for small producers. We are securing further dates in the diary to continue engagement.
Jackie Baillie.
Can I thank the Cabinet Secretary for her response? I had the pleasure of spending yesterday morning with the Loch Lomond Brewery discussing the deposit return scheme. There was no drink taken, Presiding Officer. They are in favour of the overall principle of the scheme and fully support recycling efforts, but their concerns are about the operation of the scheme in practice. And these concerns are widely shared by other craft brewers, the glass industry, the whisky industry. Indeed, about 2/3 of submissions raise substantive concerns. Now, Loch Lomond Brewery tell me that it will cost them hundreds of pounds for a barcode for Scotland. They will need separate labels, one for bottles sold in Scotland, one for elsewhere, hundreds of pounds in incorporating barcodes for each label, thousands of pounds spent on new machines to collect recycled bottles, and many of their products are purchased in Scotland, taken abroad, so there is no chance of the bottles being recycled again in Scotland. These are small craft brewers operating with small margins. They have real concerns about the impact of the deposit return scheme for glass. They would prefer to proceed on a UK-wide basis. So could I ask the Cabinet Secretary if she, rather than her officials, will meet with craft brewers and their representatives to address their concerns before passing regulations?
Well, as I indicated, officials are looking at potential for dates for meeting, and I think I need to say in response to some of what Jackie Baillie has raised there, that in fact the Deposit Return Scotland regulations don't create a requirement for separate Scottish labelling, and therefore will not mandate a separate stock keeping unit for producers. So I think there's some issues in and around this that are perhaps arising out of a misunderstanding. It is also one of the reasons why we wanted to ensure that this scheme, when it is up and running, is actually industry-led. It is not being something designed by us. We want industry to design it, run it. The Norwegian example is the example that we are mostly attracted by. And that these issues, and they are real issues, and I understand, and I too hear them, are issues that are matters for the scheme administrator to consider the setting of. And I would really strongly encourage all small retailers, regardless of what they are, what part of the business that they are in, to be very much involved in the work that is being done to take forward the whole issue. This deposit return scheme will significantly increase the quantity and quality of glass recyclate that is then available for reprocessing, as well as doing really good work in terms of significantly reducing the amount of plastic that gets into our environment.
Jackie Baillie.
Can I thank the Cabinet Secretary for her further very welcome response? There is a real issue about the quality of recycling, and we know you get the most recycling out of white glass, less out of green glass, and nothing really from brown glass. Most bottles for drink are typically green and brown glass. There is also concern that we haven't maximised glass collection using existing means. For example, many local authorities, including my own, don't do doorstep glass recycling, and we feel they should be encouraged to do so. I'm delighted that the Cabinet Secretary mentioned industry design and run, because I think that is the heart of the issue. The key issue for me is that we involve the industry now, before the regulations are passed, given the concerns, given the misunderstanding with glass recycling. I would ask the Cabinet Secretary, would she consider introducing the deposit return scheme in 2 phases? The first dealing with plastics and cans, and the second introducing glass, to allow an opportunity for those really important discussions with the industry themselves.
Cabinet Secretary.
I hear what Jackie Baillie is asking there, but I think one of the difficulties is with this is that if you introduce a scheme that excludes glass at the start, it is almost prohibitively expensive and almost impossible to then retroactively add glass to the collection process, and I'm happy to engage directly with the member on that. Our current best available evidence on the current recycling rate for glass is that it sits at around about 64%. All of the evidence that we have suggests that those countries that have DRS schemes that include glass are getting a recycling rate in excess of 85%. So we are looking at a fairly significant uptick in the amount of glass that can be recycled through a DRS system. I think, Presiding Officer, I said right at the beginning of this process that plastics was a very easily understood and easily change over to a deposit return system on plastic. I accepted that glass had slightly greater issues attached to it. It is also, however, one of the most popular materials amongst the public for being included in this. 85% of people who've been surveyed want glass to be included, and one of the reasons for that, of course, is the very antisocial element that glass creates when it's left lying about. But I'm very happy to engage further with this. As I indicated in the initial answer, the organisations that I indicated are on they're on 2 separate implementation advisory working groups, and the Federation of Small Businesses also sits on the implementation advisory group. So I would hope that everybody who is involved in very particular parts of the sector is making sure that their views are being fed through their organisations onto that implementation advisory group, because that is what is going to come up with the industry-run scheme.
Maurice Golden, to be followed by Angus MacDonald.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. I refer members to my register of interests, and I welcome the comments from the Cabinet Secretary that the scheme will be industry and expert-led. However, under current plans, politicians will set the level of deposit through legislation rather than the scheme administrator. Does the Cabinet Secretary agree that technical experts would do a better job at setting the deposit level in order to meet targets?
Cabinet Secretary.
I'm not sure that I do accept that. Our decision-making around the issue of the deposit level arose directly out of the consultation that we carried out prior to embarking on this, and the public consultation reinforced the point about the majority of respondents supporting a deposit of 15 pence or more. There is a tricky issue here because the deposit has to be set precisely at that point that it doesn't create a disincentive for people buying, doesn't become a problem in the actual purchase, but isn't so low that it ceases to have the behavioural result that we want. And those are the things that we are mainly considering. Now, I do understand that there are some issues around size of container and all the rest of it that are creating some interest and debate. But at the moment, I still feel that if we're not going to start into a business of devaluing some containers in the eyes of consumers, the flat rate is the best place for us to be. But I am happy, obviously, to have these conversations with the member if there are some very specific issues that he wants to raise separately.
Angus MacDonald to be followed by Finlay Carson.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. Coincidentally, our Eclair Committee has just completed a marathon evidence session on DRS with a large number of stakeholders this morning, and we look forward to the Cabinet Secretary visiting our committee next week. So, whilst recognising the need for our system to be reflective of the needs of people in Scotland, can the Cabinet Secretary outline what lessons have been learned from international evidence, other than the Norwegian example, where DRS schemes have been implemented elsewhere?
Cabinet Secretary.
Deposit return schemes operate in more than 38 countries around the world, and I think it's important that everybody reminds themselves of that. Evidence and experience from well-developed systems around the world has underpinned the development of our scheme. Key points we've learned include the importance of the scheme being owned and operated by producers in line with the principle of producer responsibility, the return to retail approach to ensure the scheme is accessible and fair, and a deposit level that encourages the right behaviour from consumers. And that goes back to the answer that I gave to Maurice Golden about the deposit level and where we think that is best placed.
And Finlay Carson.
Widespread support for a deposit return scheme, there are concerns over the data being used on current recycling rates, particularly when it comes to aluminium cans. Could the Cabinet Secretary explain why baseline data on recycling levels is being used to back up the business case when Zero Waste Scotland specifically stated it should not be used for that purpose?
Cabinet Secretary.
I am not conscious of that statement from Zero Waste Scotland. Zero Waste Scotland are involved in all of the discussions. They're very much key to what we've brought forward, what we're doing, and they're very much involved in the implementation advisory group. I'm happy to take it up with Zero Waste Scotland if the member wants to give me some context for that and query on what basis they were making that comment. But it's a rather odd one for me to hear because it's not what I'm hearing from them. So it's perhaps a conversation we can have.
And question number 2, Michelle Ballantyne.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. To ask the Scottish Government what its response is to the reports of people being treated for diphtheria in the NHS Lothian area.
Minister Joe Fitzpatrick.
We've been informed by NHS Lothian that 2 related cases of diphtheria have been confirmed in the Lothian area, with both patients having recently returned from abroad. All close contacts of these patients have been identified, contacted and followed up in line with national agreed guidelines. The likelihood of any additional cases is very small, as most people are protected by immunisation given in childhood. In Lothian, 98% of children are vaccinated against diphtheria by the age of 24 months. The best way to avoid diphtheria while travelling is to be fully vaccinated against it, and we'd encourage anyone travelling abroad to visit the Fit for Travel website, where they can access information on how to stay safe and healthy abroad, as well as destination-specific health advice.
Michelle Ballantyne.
I thank that Cabinet Secretary for that response. My thoughts are with the 2 patients that caught this dreadfully highly contagious bacterial infection, and I'm sure the Chamber will join me in that and in thanking the medical staff at NHS Lothian for their quick response and dealing with it. The Cabinet Secretary highlighted the fact that it is really important that that we get our children vaccinated when they are young and follow the schedules that are put in place, but also that when travelling, that we do actually go and seek advice. So I welcome the fact that he has reiterated that, and I hope that across the country you will agree with me that people should check that their vaccinations are up to date, and particularly with things like diphtheria, which does require a 10-year booster, that they go and check even if they're not sure.
Minister.
I thank the member for the way she's raised this question. I do think it is a good opportunity for us to remind everyone of the importance of vaccination, both in childhood and when travelling. And again, I'd recommend that people take a look at the Fit for Travel website to seek advice and, if necessary, then go and speak to their GP about what vaccinations they should have.
Michelle Ballantyne.
That's fine.
Further questions? Sarah Boyack.
Can I thank the Minister for his first answer when he mentioned the Fit for Travel website? Can the Minister think about not just the issue of getting people immunised as children, but thinking about how you raise awareness of not just the issue of diphtheria, but other contagious infections which can be widespread in other parts of the world, and to think about how we get that message out to all ages to avoid people being hit by these diseases?
Minister.
Let me be clear again. I would recommend that anyone travelling abroad should visit the Fit for Travel website and seek advice from their GP practice as to what services are available and required for their particular visit abroad.
Thank you very much. And that concludes topical questions. Now we're going to move on now to the next item of business, which is a statement by Hamza Youssef on Sheku Bayo, next steps. The Cabinet Secretary will take questions at the end of his statement, and I would encourage members who wish to ask a question to press their request to speak buttons as soon as possible. And I call on the Cabinet Secretary, Hamza Youssef.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. As members will be aware, the Lord Advocate met with the family of Sheku Bayo yesterday to inform them of the outcome of the victim's right to review process in connection with the circumstances of Mr Bayo's tragic death in 2015. Mr Bayo died in the course of an operation by police officers to restrain him, and I know the thoughts of members across the Chamber will be with his family and friends at this difficult time. Following what has been a complex and thorough investigation and review, the Lord Advocate has confirmed that on the basis of the evidence available, there will be no criminal proceedings against Police Scotland or individual police officers in connection with Mr Bayo's death. The First Minister and I met with the family today to express our deepest condolences and assure them of our commitment to establishing the facts surrounding this tragic incident. They are right to expect a full public examination of the circumstances of Mr Bayo's death, and I stated my determination to put in place a process to deliver that. Today, I can confirm I will establish a statutory public inquiry under the Inquiries Act 2005 into the circumstances leading up to and, crucially, following Mr Bayo's death. Indeed, all deaths in police custody are subject to a mandatory fatal accident inquiry under the Fatal Accident and Sudden Deaths, etc. Scotland Act 2016. The responsibility for establishing the FAI sits with the Procurator Fiscal under the direction of Lord Advocate. FAIs examine the cause of death and consider steps to prevent other deaths in similar circumstances. In this case, however, the Lord Advocate, as head of the system for the investigations of death in Scotland, considers the remit of an FAI would not allow all the issues which require to be investigated to be addressed. FAIs can examine circumstances and factors leading up to a death, but not what follows after. And in this case, the Lord Advocate has identified questions raising issues of public interest and importance about the early stages of the post-incident management of the investigation that an FAI simply could not examine. That being the case, it is imperative that the circumstances leading up to Mr Bayo's death and the events that followed are examined in full and in public. I'm conscious that public inquiries are significant undertakings, and this is not a decision to be made in haste. As members will be aware, Mr Bayo's family have been calling for a public inquiry for a number of years, and the First Minister made clear it was definitely an option. When I met the family last year, I assured them that this government shared the family's commitment to getting answers. On that basis, it is one option I've been considering in advance of the confirmation yesterday of the Lord Advocate's decision, not to preempt that decision, but to be prepared for this outcome. Now that we have confirmation that there will be no criminal proceedings in this case, and having examined all other options, I believe that as a government, it is right that we should hold a public inquiry. I have discussed this with Mr Bayo's family, honouring my commitment to update them first. They were very clear in their determination to get to the facts surrounding Mr Bayo's tragic death, and a public inquiry is now the surest way to do this. The terms of reference of the public inquiry will determine the scope, the direction and parameters of the inquiry. So it will be important to take time to get them right. It will cover matters which will be covered by an FAI and also a range of other issues, such as the post-incident management of the investigation. The formulation of the terms of reference will require discussion with the person appointed to chair the inquiry, and I'll also wish to discuss the draft terms of reference with those most directly affected by the inquiry with a view to shaping a remit that is clearly focused. We must not lose sight of the purpose of this inquiry, to establish the circumstances leading to and following the tragic death of Mr. Baillie, in order to identify any steps which could prevent deaths in similar circumstances, and to improve the post-incident management following such deaths. Let me be clear, Presiding Officer, for any independent scrutiny of this case to be rigorous and credible, it must address the question of whether or not Mr. Baillie's race played a part in how the incident was approached and dealt with by the police. In saying that, I am not prejudging the answer to that question. That will be for the inquiry, which will be independent of ministers. In order to do this effectively, the inquiry must be equipped with the necessary diversity of expertise and backgrounds to scrutinise the extent to which race was a factor in this case. I will be discussing how we can build diversity into the structures of this inquiry with the Chair, who will be instrumental in helping to shape the terms of reference. The formal process directed to appointing a Chair will begin shortly, and it will be important to ensure the Chair will command the confidence of those involved and indeed of the wider public. This will include ensuring an appropriate level of expertise and taking forward the remit of the inquiry. This too will take time, but I will return to the Chamber to provide a full statement confirming the inquiry's terms of reference and the Chair early next year. If systemic issues emerge that were causal or contributory factors in this case, then it is right that the inquiry addresses these. While we must be careful not to expand the terms of reference beyond its core purpose, not least to avoid further delaying the process for all involved, it's important that all relevant issues are covered. However, it is not intended that this inquiry will consider the wider framework for investigations into serious incidents involving the police, given that, as members will be aware, Dame Alicia Angelini is currently reviewing law and practice for complaint handling, investigations and misconduct in relation to policing. There may be areas of shared interest between the review and this public inquiry, but Dame Angelini's review is not investigating individual cases, whereas the primary purpose of this inquiry will be to examine the circumstances of this specific case. I am, of course, aware of other families who have lost loved ones in tragic circumstances and are looking for answers. My thoughts and those of colleagues in the Chamber remain with those families. In a number of cases, complex investigations are still underway, while others may have been subject to other processes, including the FAI process. Each of these cases will have its own distinct features, and it is important to allow these processes to run their course. As I set out in my letter to the Justice Committee last week, I recognise there are questions about the arrangements within the SPS and NHS for handling deaths and prison custody. That is why I've asked Her Majesty's Chief Inspectorate of Prisons to undertake a review into the handling of deaths in prison custody. In addition to HMC IPS, I've asked Professor Nancy Laux of Families Outside to work alongside and provide external expertise. The review will have a sharp human rights focus and ensure the voices of families of those in prison is heard. But turning back to policing, Presiding Officer, it is worth noting that since the establishment of Police Scotland, public scrutiny of policing has never been greater, and understandably so. It is essential that public and parliamentary confidence in the police remains strong, and I know members will share my view that police officers and staff across Scotland work hard to keep us all safe. The 2018-19 annual report by Her Majesty's Inspector of Constabulary in Scotland stated that, and I quote, "We continue to be impressed by the determination of officers and staff to delivering an effective policing to the communities they serve." We know the majority of adults also said police were doing a good or excellent job in their local area. As a government, we remain committed to excellence in policing, and our commitment to protect Scotland's police revenue budget has seen their annual budget increase by more than 80 million since 2016-17. But of course, policing by consent depends upon accountability, and it is vital that the police are held to account when things go wrong. I know, having spoken to the Chief Constable regularly, that he also values this accountability. I'm clear that a public inquiry will provide the independent and robust mechanism needed to give us that clear understanding. As with all statutory inquiries, it will be inquisitorial rather than adversarial. It will also identify lessons and improvement for the future to help prevent deaths in similar circumstances and build trust and confidence in policing. Let me finish, Presiding Officer, by expressing my condolences once again to Mr Bayo's family and friends who have been unwavering in their search for answers. I am confident that a statutory public inquiry under the 2005 Act will provide the best means of establishing the circumstances leading to and following Mr Bayo's tragic death.
Thank you very much, Cabinet Secretary. The Cabinet Secretary will now take questions. Call Liam Kerr to be followed by James Kelly. Liam Kerr.
Thank you, Presiding Officer, and I'm very grateful to the Cabinet Secretary for advance sight of his statement. Firstly, I would like to associate myself and this party with the Cabinet Secretary's expression of deepest condolences to the family of Mr Bayo and understand their need for a full public examination of the circumstances of Mr Bayo's death to establish the facts. We are therefore pleased that the Cabinet Secretary will establish a public inquiry under the Inquiries Act 2005 into those circumstances and identify lessons and improvements. A number of questions arise from the Cabinet Secretary's statement. Firstly, this tragic incident took place in 2015. Therefore, it's taken 4 years to get to this point. Given that, can the Cabinet Secretary give any more indication as to the timescales that will be involved in setting up and conducting the public inquiry and any indication of when it might report? Secondly, is the Cabinet Secretary able to advise what kind of inquiry this will be and the level of it? Specifically, will it be judge-led? And finally, is the Cabinet Secretary able to give us any further detail as to why a fatal accident inquiry was not felt to be appropriate, and specifically the questions identified by the Lord Advocate?
Cabinet Secretary.
Can I thank Liam Kerr for those important questions and the tone in which he asked them. I agree with him that there has been a long search for answers from the family of Mr Bayo. I can't comment too much on the reasons for those delays, as Liam Kerr will be absolutely aware. The examination and investigation into whether or not there was to be criminal proceedings would be one, and was one, conducted independently by the Crown, with no rightly ministerial influence into that. So the reasons for that length of time are really for the Crown to answer, and I'm sure they would have been certainly part of the conversation that took place between Lord Advocate and the Bayo family yesterday. But in saying that, there is a balance to be struck between ensuring that the public inquiry forensically examines not just the specific instance here, an incident that we are discussing and referring to, the tragic death of Mr Bayo, but also, of course, it can look at further systemic or potentially systemic issues, but not being so wide that it loses focus and therefore, of course, exacerbates that challenge, that difficulty, that hurt that the family has felt because of the timescale it has taken to get to this point. So there will be a fine balance to get, and that will be part of the discussion about the remit, which I will have with stakeholders that have an interest in this, as well, of course, with the chair of the inquiry. In terms of his question around it being judge-led, again, he'll forgive me, we will take some time to have a discussion with stakeholders, and I should say I welcome any conversations with members of the opposition also. What I tried to say in my statement, it will be really important that, as well as having a chair, having the appropriate expertise, particularly on issues around race and diversity, are going to be hugely important to be built in. And we've seen that in some inquiries down south, for example, when I think about the Macpherson inquiry. We've also seen where that hasn't been done correctly. There was often criticism of the inquiry into Grenfell because of that lack of diversity, considering the tragedy and the victims that were involved in some of that. So we want to make sure we learn the lessons of inquiries, both that are taking place in Scotland and in other parts of the UK. In terms of the FAI question that Liam Kerr asked, which again is a very pertinent and important one, the Lord Advocate has said, and I should say he's happy for me to say this on the record, that's why it's in my statement. He doesn't give me this advice as law officers. Of course, we wouldn't disclose law officer advice, but in his remit as the head of investigations into deaths, he says very clearly that the FAI would not be able to examine the post-incident management of the tragic death of Mr Baillie, and I think for anybody objectively looking at that case, there are questions that have to be answered, not just in the lead-up to Mr Baillie's death, but absolutely the follow-on and the post-incident management of that. And FAI simply would not cover that, and therefore a public inquiry under the Public Inquiries Act 2005, I think, is the absolute right decision to make in this case.
James Kelly, to be followed by John Finney. James Kelly.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. Can I thank the Cabinet Secretary for advance sight of the statement and also offer my deepest sympathies to Mr Baillie's family. It is shocking in modern Scotland the circumstances in which Mr Baillie has lost his life, and it's unacceptable that nobody has been held legally responsible. From that point of view, I strongly support the Cabinet Secretary's announcement today that there will be a public inquiry. There is a concern in this case and other cases about the lack of transparency around the Lord Advocate's decisions on non-prosecution and the granting of immunity for police officers and prison officers. Can I therefore ask the Cabinet Secretary if the public inquiry will examine recent cases and review the protocol the Lord Advocate follows in reaching a decision for non-prosecution or granting of immunity from police or prison officers?
Cabinet Secretary.
Can I thank James Kelly for the question? It's an important one, but also a very difficult question, because he knows as well as I do, and for very good reason, the importance of the independence of the Lord Advocate. That, of course, doesn't translate into not being accountable. Our judiciary, our Crown, of course, while independent of government and independent of parliamentarians, that does not mean that they are not accountable for those decisions. The Lord Advocate himself, of course, is and has been on occasion, of course, answerable to this Parliament, answering questions in the very spot that I am standing in. In terms of any decision for immunity, again, I hope James Kelly will understand why I'm answering this way, but that would, of course, be a question for the Lord Advocate and for the Crown. It would be absolutely unacceptable for the Justice Secretary to make a decision on who should receive immunity from prosecution or not in a whole range of cases, and I think James Kelly would understand that. Equally, let me say that I would understand James Kelly's and other people's frustration if the government and I have chosen to set up a public inquiry, if those that attended that public inquiry were not giving full and frank answers. So there is a decision for the Lord Advocate to make in respect to immunity. In terms of other cases, this public inquiry is specifically looking at the Sheiko Baillie case, and it will focus on that case. It will look at some of the systemic issues around that, and some of those systemic issues around that, if they are raised, they may well be relevant to other cases that have gone by previously. But of course, the focus on this case will be for the very unique circumstances involved in it, be on the tragic incident that took place involving Mr Baillie.
John Finney, to be followed by Liam MacArthur. John Finney.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. And as with others in the Chamber, our thoughts are with Mr Baillie's family and friends. And thank you to the Cabinet Secretary for early sight of that statement. Can I push a bit further on Mr Kelly's question to the Cabinet Secretary? Because whilst it's entirely appropriate that the decision regarding criminal immunity is a matter for the Lord Advocate, can you tell the Chamber whether anyone has been granted criminal immunity in respect of any future inquiry? And can you outline whether such an inquiry would have powers to compel witnesses to attend, I think particularly of perhaps former police officers, including ex-Chief Constable Stephen House?
Cabinet Secretary.
Again, I can't add too much more than what I said to James Kelly's. It would be for the Lord Advocate. I don't think a determination has been made, I should say, but I caveat that with saying that is my understanding thus far. But any decision on immunity in the future will be absolutely for Lord Advocate, and so he would be answerable for a decision on that. In terms of compelling witnesses, it's absolutely my understanding that under the Inquiries Act 2005, the witnesses can be compelled. Not complying with an instruction from the chair of the inquiry could lead to some offences being committed. So that is why I think a public inquiry under the 2005 Act, with all the powers that grants a chair, and an inquiry, I think is the absolute right way to proceed.
Liam MacArthur, to be followed by David Torrance.
Thank you. Can I start by thanking the Cabinet Secretary for early sight of his statement? Very much welcome the announcement in relation to the inquiry, and extend my condolences to family and friends of Sheikh Bayu, a family that has been left looking for answers for the past 4 years. At the same time, police officers have been left in limbo, and I think, as the Cabinet Secretary acknowledged, the public is potentially less safe as a result of lessons not having been learned. Following on the question from James Kelly, I appreciate the sensitivities around this, but 4 years is surely far too long to wait. Can we not look at ways in which this system can be speeded up, can be made more efficient, so that other families are not put through the same sort of trauma as the Sheikh Bayu family has undoubtedly been put through over the last 4 years?
Cabinet Secretary.
Can I thank Liam MacArthur for his question? Can I again reiterate how much I admire the family of Sheikh Bayu? You know, 4.5 years after such a tragic incident, and having faced a number of obstacles, difficulties, hurdles, they have been unwavering in their search for answers into what happened and the follow-on after Sheiko's death. Sheiko's mother lives 3,500 miles away in Freetown in Sierra Leone. She's here today. She's often come to Scotland to be with her family. And I can see from meeting her today that she's a rock of that family, to make sure that she gets the answers to the questions of why she lost her son and what on earth happened in the aftermath of that. So can I restate and join Liam MacArthur in his admiration for the Bayu family. In terms of the substance of his question, again, I know Liam MacArthur has often pressed on this point, and he's right to do so, that I agree with him, that 4.5 years is a long time to wait for answers. I know that there are questions around the delays and FAIs as well. What I can do is give some reassurance. Again, this is very much in the remit of the Lord Advocate. The officials, members of the Parliament may be aware that the Lord Advocate has said very publicly that he is looking at ways to reduce that delay. He has been reviewing the reasons for that delay, and he understands the frustration of families around and surrounding that delay. So I have to be, of course, sensitive and rightly sensitive to the fact that this is very much in the domain of the independent Lord Advocate. But it's fair to say he is not unaware of the frustration that delay can cause, and any ways to minimise that. Certainly, if government can do anything, then I would be supportive of that.
Thank you, David Torrance, to be followed by Margaret Mitchell. David Torrance.
As MSP for Kirkcaldy, can I once again express my condolences to Mr Bayu's family and friends, who we can all agree have been unwavering in their search for answers. There has been much speculation around this tragic incident, and the establishment of a statutory public inquiry is the best means of establishing the circumstances leading to and following Mr Bayu's death. Does the Cabinet Secretary agree we must now allow the forthcoming inquiry to do its job?
Well, I think this is a crucial point made by David Torrance. There have been a number of questions that have, of course, remained unanswered, hence the reason for the public inquiry. But I'm afraid sometimes in that vacuum, there have been really quite, I would say, insensitive is the nicest word I could possibly use, insensitive accusations and, frankly, sometimes smears that have been thrown and bandied around. I think that is not just deeply unhelpful, but I can imagine incredibly hurtful as well for the family involved. You know, Sheiko was roughly my age. He was a Muslim, much like me. He was a minority living in Scotland, much like I am. And, you know, there are some really fundamental questions that have to be asked around not just the events leading up to his death, but frankly, some of the processes that took place afterwards. And I, as Justice Secretary, want to have absolute confidence in the processes that exist in the justice system that I preside over, to ensure that if, you know, hopefully we can prevent a death like this ever happening again. But if it ever did tragically happen again, that I have absolute confidence in the processes that follow on. So David Torrance is right. For all those involved, for all the stakeholders, but of course emotions are high, no doubt with the family, but also, of course, I don't doubt for the police and for officers involved. that actually maybe there needs to be, everybody needs to understand that at the heart of this is a man who lost his life and a family who are devastated by that. So everybody should let the inquiry, frankly, do the job that the inquiry is meant to do, and that is to get to the truth and answer the questions that remain at this moment in time unanswered.
Margaret Mitchell, to be followed by Jenny Gilruth.
Presiding Officer, I too extend my condolences to the family and friends of Mr Baillie. Can the Cabinet Secretary confirm if there is a mechanism to establish how often a decision has been taken not to prosecute where someone has died in either police or prison custody, and where concerns have been expressed about the action or conduct of either Police Scotland or individual police officers, or SPS or individual prison officers? And does he agree that this information is vitally important to establish openness and transparency in these tragic circumstances?
Cabinet Secretary.
Can I say to Margaret Mitchell that the many times I've appeared in front of her committee, I know her commitment and I hope she knows mine to transparency right throughout the justice system. So anything that we can do around that transparency, I think, is crucially important. Again, I reiterate, and I know she understands this, that the decisions to prosecute or not to prosecute, the decisions to effectively give immunity or not, are ones very much for the independent Lord Advocate, and none of us, be it government or opposition politicians, should have a say in that or seek to influence that unduly. In terms of the substance of her question around the data, around how many individuals who have been in these circumstances or similar circumstances around deaths in custody, be they in police or prison, being prosecuted or not, I will take that away. And as a result of her question, I will explore whether or not that data exists with the Crown and whether there's something more that we can do, because we should not, and we do not, and I certainly do not fear anything from additional transparency.
Jenny Gilruth, to be followed by Claire Baker. Jenny Gilruth.
Thank you, Presiding Officer, and can I add my condolences to Mr Baillieu's family. Whilst we must not prejudge the answer to the question of whether or not Mr Baillieu's race played a part in how the incident was dealt with by the police, for any independent scrutiny of this case to be rigorous and credible, it must address that very question. Can the Cabinet Secretary therefore confirm the intention for this inquiry to be equipped with the necessary diversity of both expertise and background?
Cabinet Secretary.
Again, I do, and I wish to restate and re-emphasise that very point, that we cannot simply remove the issue of race from this very pertinent question. Race is undoubtedly a question that has to be answered. I don't prejudge that, but we have to allow a chair, a public inquiry, an independent public inquiry, to investigate whether or not, and to determine whether or not race played a part, any part, in how this incident was dealt with by police. And the point that Jenny Gilruth makes is hugely important, that in order to gain the confidence of our communities, of the family of Mr Baillie, but I would hope the public at large, it is vitally important that the structures within any public inquiry of this nature, and of this one in particular, reflect the expertise that we'd expect it to when that question is being examined, and to ensure that it reflects the diversity of our communities. So I'll explore how to do that. There are some examples of public inquiries, largely from England and Wales, that have managed to factor in that expertise. And I will have a closer look on how to do that. And as I say, I will report back to this Parliament, hopefully early next year.
Claire Baker, to be followed by Rona Mackay. Claire Baker.
Presiding Officer, I met the family of Sheku Baillie days after his death, and it was one of the most affecting meetings I've ever had as an MSP. I have seen them display fortitude and resilience over the past 4.5 years, and their loss deserves answers and for the truth to come out. And the Cabinet Secretary has today made the right decision, and I very much welcome it. It is vital that the public inquiry has the confidence of the family. Can the Cabinet Secretary explain what is intended when he says in the statement he will discuss draft terms of reference with those most directly affected by the inquiry? Can I ask who this will include, or if that's a direct reference to the family?
Cabinet Secretary.
The short answer is yes to that. Claire Baker will also be aware that of course there'll be other interested parties as well. I've not had a request from the likes of the Federation, the Police Federation, for example. But of course it may well come, and therefore, of course, in any inquiry it's important to give confidence to the independence and the impartiality of that inquiry, that where those requests from interested and relevant stakeholders come in, then I will give them absolute due consideration. But she can take it absolutely from my answer that part of that discussion would be absolutely with the family and indeed the legal representatives of Mr Bayo. Can I also again join her in once again saluting the fortitude and the dignity actually that the Bayo family have shown. Can I also thank Claire Baker, who I know has stood by the family and their calls for a public inquiry for many, many years.
Rona Mackay, to be followed by Donald Cameron.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. The Cabinet Secretary is aware there are other families who have lost loved ones in tragic circumstances and are looking for answers. Can the Cabinet Secretary confirm that each of these cases have their own distinct features, with a number of complex investigations still taking place, and that it is important to allow those processes to run their individual courses?
Cabinet Secretary.
I think that is an important point for anybody who's lost a loved one, be it in prison or indeed in police custody or care. Then I can completely understand their desire for a full, frank investigation and inquiry into that tragic death. But Ronald Mackay is right, every incident is very unique and individual to that circumstance. And there are a range of processes that can take place. Some incidents and tragic deaths that have been referenced in this chamber on previous occasions have gone through the process of a court trial, some through the process of an FAI. Some are still being determined by the Lord Advocate on whether there should be an FAI or not. But I think it's important to absolutely understand where each individual family comes from. We should empathise absolutely with that. But I think in this circumstance, for all the reasons I've outlined, and I won't rehearse again, that an FAI simply would not be adequate. And therefore, that's why I've instructed a public inquiry under the 2005 Act.
Donald Cameron, to be followed by Fulton McGregor. Donald Cameron.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. Can I return to the issue of time, which many others have already raised? It is over 4.5 years since the death of Mr Bayo, a very long time on any view for a family to wait for answers. Setting aside the delays so far and looking to the future, can the Cabinet Secretary reassure this chamber that the inquiry will be set up as quickly as practicable, though plainly not cutting corners in terms of the thoroughness of its investigations?
Cabinet Secretary.
Yes, I can. And Donald Cameron, in his question, very eloquently articulates what the challenge will be. The challenge will be to ensure that there is not any unnecessary delay, because the family have frankly suffered enough, and I'm certain other stakeholders that have an interest in this will want the inquiry to take place underway quickly. At the same time, there will be a need to ensure that we're thorough. I think this will be a public inquiry, frankly, unlike any other public inquiry we've had in Scotland. And again, in relation to the questions that will be asked, the need to build in either a panel or special advisors, but I think probably a panel of expertise to inform a chair and to sit alongside a chair to ensure that all the questions that need to be answered are indeed answered. So what I don't want to do is at this stage commit to what that remit will look like. I'll take some time, not unnecessary time, but I'll take some time to have a conversation with the stakeholders around remit. And it'll be a challenge, but one that I'm sure we will be up to ensure that the remit is focused, but yet it's not so unwieldy, but addresses still systemic issues, and getting that challenge is going to be important. But clearly, whatever remit is decided upon will have an effect on the timescales involved of any public inquiry. So I can give them an absolute assurance there will be no unnecessary delay from our part in government. But equally, I hope members will understand, I'm sure they do, that these things do take a bit of time to make sure we get it right.
Fulton McGregor, to be followed by Anas Sarwar. Fulton McGregor.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. Can I place on record my condolences to the family as well? The Cabinet Secretary spoke about identifying a chair. Can he just confirm for the Chamber and those listening the timeframe he has in mind as to identifying a chair and any support for them, and when he will report back to the Parliament when those developments are known?
Cabinet Secretary.
I should be able to, my hope would be to come back to this Parliament early next year, and the earlier, frankly, the better. But obviously, again, as these things tend to be, the processes for these things can sometimes take time, but also are not entirely my gift. If we do want a judge to be leading this inquiry, then of course that would necessitate a conversation with the Lord President, who would then of course need to speak to senators and make a judgment on who is available, and then that individual would have to of course agree to lead that inquiry, and indeed the fact that we wish to build an expertise would have to be something that they would accept as well. So, I'm hoping we can get that done sooner rather than later. There's only a limited amount of work that I've been able to do in advance of this, because although I've planned for this outcome as well as for the outcome, the other outcome, of course, we could not do much more than just simply prepare and plan, because we had to wait for the Lord Advocate to make a decision in relation to any further criminal proceedings. So some of this is in my gift, and what is in my gift I will try to do as quickly as I possibly can, so there are not any further delays for the Baillie family who have suffered enough.
Anna Sauer, to be followed by James Dornan. Anna Sauer.
President Officer, my thoughts are with the family and friends of Sheikh Bayo, and I must also recognise the efforts of their legal team, in particular Amar Anwar, who has relentlessly pursued this case. I also welcome and thank the Cabinet Secretary for the announcement of a public inquiry today. While he's right to say that we can't definitively say that race was a factor in this case, there is no doubt that there is structural racism in Scotland. If we are to build confidence between our communities, the tone is also really important. Will you therefore take the opportunity to make comment on the rather juvenile attempts by the President of the Scottish Police Federation in relation to this case? I understand that the President will want to represent his members and defend his members. That is, of course, his right. But at the same time, that can't be allowed to undermine the confidence in this case, to undermine the feelings of the Bayo family, or indeed of ethnic minority officers within the police who may also have challenges around structural race issues.
Cabinet Secretary.
Anas, as always, on these issues speaks with a lot of authority, but also articulates the problem and the issues, the sensitivities of this case, I think, very, very well. There's not much for me to add to what he's already said. I think at the heart of this, we must never forget that there is a man, not much difference in age to Anas and I. He was a Muslim, like Anas and I. He was a minority living in Scotland, like Anas and I, who lost his life. And like Anas and I, he has a loving family who obviously have been fighting on his behalf ever since. But at the heart of this, yes, there are other stakeholders, of course, and there have been challenges, no doubt, that those stakeholders have also faced. But at the heart of it, somebody has lost their life. So anybody attempting to dehumanise that, anybody attempting to smear, anybody attempting to downplay the seriousness of this needs to take a very, very long, hard look at themselves in the mirror and think twice about what they're doing. So I would associate myself with the remarks, and I would ask all of those involved. Of course, emotions run high. Of course, people are angry. Of course, people are frustrated. But it is important for the memory of Sheikh Bayo, if nothing else, that people conduct themselves in a way that is worthy of such a cause, and let the inquiry, the independent public inquiry, do its job.
And James Dornan.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. Following confirmation there will be no criminal proceedings in this case, it is right the Government's holding a public inquiry to get to the facts surrounding Mr Bayo's tragic death. And just following on from the comments that Mr Sarwar just made there, does the Cabinet Secretary agree that the onus is now on all of us, not just those in the Chamber, but those online, to approach this with the sensitivity and respect it deserves, and that that is the least that Mr Bayo's family is entitled to from all of us?
Cabinet Secretary.
Yes, I do believe that, for all the reasons I've just outlined in my question previous. But he's absolutely right, James Dornan, to also mention parliamentarians in that, because again, parliamentarians will have a view, I'm sure, themselves of what happened. They will have watched documentaries, they will have read newspaper reports, they may have received briefing from all different relevant stakeholders, from the legal representatives, and so on and so forth. But it is really important that nothing is said to prejudice the independent inquiry and that we allow an independent inquiry to do the job that it is meant to do. And so I'd ask all colleagues, and I include myself very much in this, that they show not just an element of consideration, but also be mindful of the fact that we're going to be entering into the inquiry stage. And of course, on that, I'll ensure that we keep the Parliament updated on the next steps moving forward, Presiding Officer.
Thank you very much, and I would thank the Cabinet Secretary and all the members for their contributions. That concludes this item of business. We're going to move on shortly to the next item.
The next item of business is a debate on motion 19809 in the name of Ben Macpherson on protecting the rights of EU citizens in Scotland. Can I invite those members who wish to speak in the debate to press the request to speak buttons now, and I call on Ben Macpherson to speak to and move the motion. Minister, please.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. I'm very glad to open today's important debate, but unfortunately I'm also deeply disappointed that over 3 years on from the 2016 referendum on membership of the European Union, EU citizens in our communities who are our friends, neighbours, colleagues and in many cases family continue to experience unnecessary and unpleasant insecurity and anxiety. Every member in the Chamber will have constituents from other EU and EEA countries who have had to deal in the last 3 years with unacceptable turbulence as they try to navigate the process of staying in a country they have done us the privilege of choosing to make and call home. Many EU citizens have been here for decades, have set up businesses here, have raised their families in Scotland. They are part of Scotland, and we are Scotland together. Many EU citizens are here to study in our colleges and universities, are playing vital roles in the delivery of public services, and are contributing to our shared culture and communities across the country. And the anxiety that has been felt is reflected in the Labour amendment today, and we will be accepting it as a result of that and for other reasons. Amidst the continued uncertainty that EU citizens feel, we must all collectively ensure that EU citizens continue to feel valued and welcomed here in Scotland, and to do our best to provide that reassurance. EU citizens are a welcome and integral part of communities across the country, and we want and indeed need them to stay. Of course, we are all still EU citizens. We can still enjoy the freedom to live, study, work, trade and travel across the 28 member states of the European Union. But when I talk about EU citizens today, I'm talking about citizens from other EU countries. And I'm also talking about citizens from the EEA and EFTA countries who are also facing the loss of their rights if Brexit happens. And while there are separate arrangements for Irish citizens who, no matter what happens, will continue to benefit from the provisions of the Common Travel Area, some Irish nationals may wish to apply for the EU settlement scheme, especially if they have non-EU family members. Presiding Officer, just over a year ago, this Chamber came to a general consensus on the significant economic, social and cultural contributions made by EU citizens to Scotland, and reaffirmed its support for our friends, neighbours, colleagues and loved ones who have done us the honour of making Scotland their home. We want EU citizens to continue to feel welcome in Scotland and to retain their right to stay. The UK Government's EU settlement scheme has now been open for over 7 months, and over 92,700 applications have been received from EU citizens in Scotland. It is important to be clear here that the numbers relate to applications rather than applicants. And given an individual may need to submit multiple applications, firstly for pre-settled status and then for settled status, we all need to be careful about claiming certainty over the number of individuals who have successfully secured their status. The UK Government has not published that more detailed information. However, even if we take the most positive interpretation of the UK Government's figures, then at the most, only around 42% of the estimated total number of EU nationals living in Scotland have applied to the scheme. The EU settlement scheme figures clearly show that there is a challenge to increase application rates, especially among certain communities that are vulnerable or remote. While the EU settlement scheme, as it is now, is something that the Scottish Government has questions about, we are committed to working together with others to support EU citizens in Scotland. And although the UK Government has said that EU citizens are not required to apply to the EU settlement scheme until December 2020 at the earliest, we remain deeply concerned that EU citizens could fail to secure settled status due to a lack of awareness of the scheme and the requirement to apply. Yes?
Alec Rowley.
On that point, I'm grateful for the intervention. On that point, I know that in Fife, a whole section of voluntary organisations have come together to work on that. And I know the government's put money in, but do you accept that we will need more resources to fund the third sector to try and reach as many people as possible?
Minister.
I will come to the support through the Stay in Scotland campaign in a moment, and I would encourage Mr Rowley, if he has details of those organisations, to feed them into my office as part of our ongoing thinking about how we develop the Stay in Scotland campaign. Because we did launch the Stay in Scotland campaign as an important mechanism to raise awareness of the EU settlement scheme and highlight how much the Scottish Government values the contributions made by EU citizens living and working in Scotland. And so far we have committed over £1 million to provide information, advice and support to EU citizens to fill the void, in too many cases, left by inadequate UK Government provision. This campaign is one of many steps the Scottish Government is taking to support EU citizens. We are funding the Citizen Advice Scotland to deliver an advice and crucially a support and crucially advice service for EU citizens and their families who may need additional help. And we are working with organisations such as the 3 Million and the Citizens' Rights Project to provide support and advice for EU citizens and deliver a series of events for EU citizens across Scotland with others to raise awareness about what they need to do to stay. Presiding Officer, while the Scottish Government encourages people to apply to stay, we do empathise that some EU citizens may be wary of applying to a scheme that seems beset with technical and operational problems. Members will have seen media reports about cases of EU citizens who have been awarded incorrect status, EU citizens who have been living here for decades who are struggling to prove their residence, and EU citizens waiting far longer than the Home Office estimated processing times for a decision. That's why the Scottish Government has been clear for some time now that EU citizens should not have to apply to retain their right to live, work and study in this country. It is why we have consistently called for the EU settlement scheme to be a declarative registration system instead of a constitutive application system. This is a principled point, but also because we, like many others across the UK, are deeply concerned about the consequences for those EU citizens who don't apply by the deadline or who don't apply at all. Presiding Officer, a declaratory system would make the repercussions of missing the application deadline far less severe because registration under a declaratory scheme would involve confirming rights rather than acquiring rights through application, as is the case under the current settlement scheme. The Windrush scandal demonstrates clearly the dangers of failing to safeguard the rights of EU citizens. Removing the need to make an application and consequently avoiding the threat of refusal would best protect the rights of EU citizens living here. Brandon Lewis's comments last month that EU citizens may face removal from the UK if they don't apply in time will do nothing to ease concerns. And it is completely wrong that EU citizens face potentially being dragged into the hostile environment immigration policies of the current UK Government. The UK Government at any point since the referendum in 2016 could have introduced legislation to fully protect the rights of EU citizens. It chose not to, and as a result, left EU citizens in unacceptable limbo. The UK government still has the power to give EU citizens clarity and certainty, and the Prime Minister should implement his clear commitment to provide EU citizens with absolute certainty to live and remain through a guarantee in law. The next...
Adam Tompkin.
I'm grateful to the Minister for giving way. He used the expression hostile environment. What the Home Secretary has actually said about the current government's immigration policy post-Brexit is that the current government will introduce a new, fairer immigration system that prioritises skills and what people can contribute to the United Kingdom rather than where they come from. How is that a hostile environment?
Minister.
I think Mr Tompkins should consider the experiences that people from out with the EU have experienced as a result of the hostile environment policies applied to asylum seekers and others at Dungavel, for example. But also consider this, the fact that Michael Gove has said in recent days that with regard to immigration policy, painting a picture that freedom of movement has created strain on public services and has had a negative effect on British society is deeply dangerous at a time like this, when in fact even the UK government's MAC analysis proves that EU citizens make a positive and constructive and hugely vital and enriching contribution to our society. We have benefited from freedom of movement, and at a time like this we should be standing up for the positive benefits of migration, not spreading fear and untrue alarm. And that's what the UK government have been doing in recent years, and they continue to do it, which is deeply disappointing. The next UK government should introduce primary legislation as soon as possible to set out the rights of EU citizens who are resident in the UK at the point of leaving the EU, which at the very least would guarantee the provisions set out in the withdrawal agreement for EU citizens. What's more, Presiding Officer, what's wrong with the current proposals in terms of the EU settlement scheme is that the UK government is effectively creating two classes of EU citizens. One, people who receive settled status, who will be able to stay in the UK permanently and will have their rights fully protected by law. And two, in stark contrast, people given only pre-settled status. EU citizens who have been resident in the UK for less than 5 years are only eligible to apply for pre-settled status under the current scheme. This is concerning because this status is more precarious than settled status because it doesn't give people a permanent right to stay here. There is also a real concern that the rights of people with pre-settled status could be diluted in the future and changed by secondary legislation. And thirdly, people with pre-settled status will have to make a further application to the scheme once they have accrued enough residence time for settled status. But there is a real danger that they won't remember to reapply or mistakenly believe that they have done everything they need to do to stay when they applied initially. We are still waiting for the UK government to confirm that applicants will be reminded to make another application before their temporary leave runs out. But even if they are, this all seems costly, nonsensical and bureaucratic. EU citizens could be better protected by disapplying the requirement to accrue 5 years residence and granting all successful applicants full settled status. This would represent a decisive action to clearly secure the rights of EU citizens resident in the UK at the point if and when the UK leaves the EU, and of course we hope it doesn't. Avoiding the creation of separate classes, each with different rights and status, and by creating greater clarity, removing the requirement for some individuals to apply twice to secure the long-term right to remain in the UK. Additionally, scrapping pre-settled status in favour of instead granting full settled status would be a simple step towards mitigating possible unfair treatment based on status and reducing unnecessary bureaucracy for the UK government, for those delivering frontline services and those who access them. So, Presiding Officer, either by establishing a declarative system or ensuring that all EU citizens are granted the more secure settled status, either of these would be much improved on what is on offer at the moment and provide a very welcome sense of certainty for EU citizens and for all of us, underpinned by primary legislation. What's more, Presiding Officer, EU citizens must be given the option of physical proof of settled status if requested. There are already concerning examples of, anecdotally, of the EU citizens being asked for their status by employers and others, and as highlighted by SCVO's evidence to the debate today. And we really need to be careful about the potential discrimination that is emerging, and all keep a constant watch on that developing, and making sure that we are emphasising, particularly at the moment, to employers, housing providers, those that provide financial services. EU citizens have full rights under freedom of movement at the moment, and we need to raise awareness of what their rights will be under settled status, and by removing pre-settled status, that would make it a lot easier. Presiding Officer, in conclusion to this opening of the debate, and this important debate, EU citizens play a crucial role in our economy, our public services and our communities. And whether they have lived here for months or many years, Scotland is their home, they are welcome here, and we want them to stay. So my call is to colleagues across this chamber: let us speak with one voice and make EU citizens feel valued and welcome. And let us also work together to encourage and support them to stay. And let us continue to make every effort to protect their rights to stay in Scotland, and urge any UK government to do so after the 12th of December by creating a declarative system and awarding full settled status. Presiding Officer, I move the motion in my name and look forward to today's debate.
Thank you, Minister. I now call on Donald Cameron to speak to and move Amendment 19809.2. Mr Cameron, please.
Thank you, Deputy Presiding Officer. I'm pleased to be able to open for the Scottish Conservatives in this debate, and I want to begin my remarks by taking the opportunity to agree where I can with the Minister. There is more common ground here than some would acknowledge. I agree that EU citizens who live and work in our country are highly valued. I agree that they make an extraordinarily important contribution to our society, to our culture, and to our economy in the same way that all our citizens do. And I agree that we need to encourage students from the EU to continue to come and study in our universities. And I agree that we must be an open and tolerant society, and that people who live in EU countries should feel safe visiting, living and working here. However, where I part company with the Minister is the knee-jerk criticism he makes of the UK government, a government which time and time again has committed to protecting the rights of EU citizens currently living in the UK. If anything, the current administration and the current Prime Minister have even gone further and faster than Theresa May and her government when it comes to wanting to provide certainty to those EU citizens. So the incessant scaremongering by the SNP government over the rights of EU citizens after we leave the European Union is ill-judged and deeply hypocritical.
Minister.
Cameron would like to clarify to the Chamber today whether the Scottish Conservatives agree or disagree with Michael Gove's assertions which in the last 2 days, which undermine the reality that EU citizens have contributed a net benefit to this society, and his statements undermine that overarching sense that we should all feel and consider that EU citizens have deeply enriched our society in many, many ways. And will he condemn Michael Gove's statement?
That's fine, long intervention. Mr Cameron, I'll give you your time back.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. I'm not going to rise to that. The Minister heard what I've said in great detail in the last 2 minutes. About the views of this party when it comes to...
Just a minute. Mr Tompkins, you've got mumbling-itis. You've mumbled and mumbled throughout, and I want you to stop, because you've got 9 minutes at the end. You mumbled to your heart's content then. Thank you, Mr Cameron.
Thank you, Deputy Presiding Officer. The Minister has had ample chance to listen to what I've had to say about the views of this party when it comes to valuing our EU citizens. The fact is, the SNP demanded that any Brexit deal respected the rights of EU citizens. And the current withdrawal agreement bill does just that. The Minister said in his speech, we want clarity in law. Well, there it is, in Article 10 of the withdrawal agreement. But the SNP voted against that legislation last month at its second reading, legislation that protects EU citizens after we leave the EU. And the SNP also voted against Theresa May's withdrawal agreement bill 3 times. Thus, at a number of points during this year, their actions have led to the failure to resolve Brexit and the failure to pass a fair Brexit deal that protects the economy, protects jobs, and protects those EU citizens who have made Scotland their home. So as a result, Deputy Presiding Officer, perhaps you will understand why these benches treat the usual platitudes and usual grandstanding on the benches opposite with a pretty hefty dose of scepticism, given the SNP's failure to support legislation that will guarantee the rights of EU citizens after we leave. Deputy Presiding Officer, I turn now to the substance of the government's motion. I want to reiterate the support of my party for the some 221,000 EU citizens who are resident in Scotland. As a Highlands and Islands MSP, I know all too well what a significant contribution they make to the local economy. Up to 10,000 EU citizens are employed in our food and drink sector, while over 4,500 EU citizens work in the Scottish fishing industry. And I'll give one local example. I recently visited the Callan shellfish factory in North Uist to discuss the potential challenges facing that sector in the Western Isles. And whilst I was there, I was informed about 2 fishermen who moved over from Poland and established their own scallop fishing business in 2009. That has been going strong for 10 years now, supplying fresh scallops to the factory. And just recently, they invested in a new purpose-built scallop vessel. They are optimistic about the future of their business. And that shellfish factory noted that Brexit, whilst it provides short-term challenges, does also provide long-term opportunity. This is just one example of the important contribution that EU citizens make to our country, and in this case, to our remote and rural communities in the Highlands of Scotland. Indeed, it is not just our rural economy where EU citizens make a significant impact, but also in academia, where some 19% of Scotland's academic researchers come from the EU, or in the tourism sector, where some 21,000 EU citizens work also. And all of this, in our view, reiterates the need to secure a Brexit deal which will allow Scotland and the rest of the UK to continue to attract talent and skills from the EU. The Royal Society of Edinburgh have stated, and I quote at length, the UK should promote a narrative of being open for business and seen as a welcoming destination for immigrants. It must be clear that, in particular, skilled and talented migrants are both required and valued. I could not agree more with that statement. Now, I believe that the Withdrawal Agreement Bill does this by securing the rights of those who already live and work here, as do some of the recent announcements, which add to the message, Deputy Presiding Officer, that the UK is open to those who want to work and contribute to our economy and society. Such as the announcement just recently that the number of places allocated through the Seasonal Agricultural Workers Scheme will be increased from 2,500 to 10,000. A reminder, I will, indeed.
Annabel Ewing.
I'm grateful to the member for taking intervention. The member will be aware, nonetheless, that organisations like, for example, the NFU have said that, in fact, UK-wide we need at least in the order of 80,000 seasonal workers. So how on earth does the 10,000 revision fit into that?
Donald Cameron.
The 10,000 figure follows the express recommendation of the Scottish Affairs Committees, chaired by Peter Wishart, no less, which stated that there should be an expansion to the seasonal workers scheme to 10,000. But of course, once the required objective is reached, the grievance machine cranks into action and the goalposts are moved. There is also the current proposal to establish a new NHS visa to help encourage more healthcare professionals to come and work in the UK. This will undoubtedly have significant benefits for Scotland, given the disastrous manner in which the SNP government have failed to manage and plan for our NHS workforce, or the announcement in September that the post-study work visa would be reintroduced, which not only provides security for those who have chosen to study here from abroad, but provides the incentive to stay in the UK and to further enhance our economy and culture. In each respect, Deputy Presiding Officer, this highlights the commitment of the UK government to expand opportunities to work in our country, and importantly ensures that we continue to welcome new citizens to the UK. Now, the remarks made by the Minister concerning the EU settlement scheme, I feel it is right and proper to address those directly and to reassure any EU citizens who are watching this debate that we welcome them and that this process is not obstructive but a necessary one. The settled status scheme ensures that access to benefits and other state services will remain ineffective. It requires applicants to prove their identity, show that they live in the UK, and declare any criminal convictions. This scheme is necessary so that the position of EU citizens who remain in the EU is clear and known, and I believe this scheme is the best means to do that. Many people have already signed up to the scheme, with some 1.8 million people applying up to the end of September 2019, of which 92,700 have come from Scotland. 24,700 of those applications were made in September alone. Up until the end of September, over 1.5 million applications have been settled, of which 61% have been granted settled status and 38% pre-settled status. Back in March this year, the Home Office announced a 3.75 million advertising campaign to highlight this scheme, and just a few weeks ago announced an additional £1 million to further advertise it. It is patently clear that these are not the actions of a government that is discouraging EU citizens from remaining in the UK, but one that is actively trying to help people register with the scheme prior to the deadline in December 2020. I also note the points raised by the Minister concerning the UK Government's white paper based on the proposals from the MAC Committee. There has been a significant degree of misinformation about this matter, and I would like to touch on it briefly. First and foremost, it should be noted that the white paper is just that, a white paper. It is not definitive UK government policy, and the measures proposed are proposals for consideration only. As the Home Secretary at the time, Sajid Javid, noted when it was published, he said this, he said, "That is not the final word. Rather, it is the starting point of a national conversation on a future immigration system. I am pleased to announce that the government will be launching a year-long programme of engagement across the UK to ensure that a wide range of views are heard." In September, I'm sorry, I don't have time. In September, the UK government announced a review of some of the proposals around a points-based system and salary thresholds. The review ended earlier in this month and will be published in due course. However, on the matter of a points-based system, this, of course, was something that was supported by the SNP's White Paper for Independence, which said we plan a controlled points-based system to support the migration of skilled workers for the benefit of Scotland's economy. And that is what the UK government is moving towards across the whole of the UK. So I look forward to that being welcomed by others shortly. The White Paper did propose a range of measures that we broadly welcome, including the proposal that there will continue to be no limit on the number of international students who can study in the UK, and the introduction of a streamlined application process for those who are visiting, coming to work, or coming to study. Deputy Presiding Officer, in conclusion, we want Scotland to be an open, tolerant, and welcoming country for new talents from around the world, including the EU, which allows our society to benefit as a result. We support the major contribution of EU citizens. We want them to stay after we leave the EU, and we welcome their continued contribution to our country. People are fed up with the scaremongering on the status of EU citizens. It is high time that the SNP government stop politicking on this sensitive issue and get behind the UK government as it navigates a Brexit deal which will secure the rights of EU citizens, deliver on the referendum result, and allow Scotland to prosper. And I move the amendment in my name.
Thank you very much, Mr Cameron. I now call Alec Rowley to speak to move Amendment 19809.3 in the name of Claire Baker, and perhaps you would just repeat those words.
Yes, thank you, Presiding Officer.
Clear.
I'm happy to move the amendment in the name of Claire Baker and supported by myself. In a brief from the Scottish Council for Voluntary Organisations, they point out that the current settlement status scheme places the human rights of EU citizens at fundamental risk. Their right to their private and family life, to work, to health and to social security are all undermined. EU citizens have been living here as a right, but will now be required to apply for permission to stay in their own homes and in their own communities. This cannot be right, and is why we need to be clear that if the UK leaves the European Union, the EU settlement scheme must be changed. Presiding Officer, we know that there were many lies told in the 2016 EU referendum campaign, but I draw your attention to the fact that in that referendum it was promised that there would be no change for EU citizens already lawfully resident in the UK. and that EU citizens would automatically be granted indefinite leave to remain in the UK and treated no less favourably than they are at present. Yet, under the current scheme, these promises cannot be delivered. Many EU citizens and family members will struggle to obtain their status due to a variety of factors, including a lack of awareness about the scheme, a lack of support or difficulty in obtaining documentation. Now, my own home kingdom of Fife, the third sector, are doing a lot of hard work, as I mentioned to the Minister, to raise awareness, and have set up the EU Settlement Partnership to ensure a focused approach to raising awareness, supporting and providing assistance to people with their application. Nina Munday, manager of the Fife Centre for Equalities, expressed the importance of the partnership and said, and I quote, "The settlement scheme is a very complicated process, and what we're trying to do is make it easier for an individual to apply, especially people who need additional support. What some people don't realise is that they have to apply for every single person in the household. I'm also pleased that Citizens Advice and Rights Fife have now appointed a dedicated EU settlement scheme support worker to enable the service to focus on people who might experience difficulty in assessing or using required technology to complete their application. They may find it difficult to get the evidence needed to apply, or are at greater risk due to personal circumstances and have specific immigration or residency issues. So from the front-line services in Fife, they're very clear that there is a major problem here and a major issue that must be addressed. But as SCVO have stated, no comparable application scheme anywhere has ever succeeded in reaching 100% of its audience, and it is highly unlikely that the UK government will manage to do so. They say, and I quote, "We know that it is the most vulnerable in society, including elderly and disabled people and children, who are at the greatest risk of falling through the cracks." They also point out there are many EU citizens at risk of missing out on securing immigration status. This includes, for example, women who have experienced domestic violence, victims of trafficking, older people, those without online access, those with language or cultural barriers, and those who are isolated and have less contact with the authorities. According to the latest population estimates, there were 219,000 EU nationals living in Scotland, not including students, in June 2017. This accounts for just over 4% of our population. Between 2000 and 2015, 86% of Scotland's population growth was down to immigration. And we know that we need more growth in the working age population. So the nasty party, with its message of taking control of our borders, have deliberately tried to stoke up an anti-immigration message when actually the opposite is the case. We need more people to make their lives here and work and contribute to the overall well-being of our country and our society. Indeed, economic analysis from the Scottish Government itself found that each additional EU citizen working in Scotland contributes a further £34,400 to GDP. The report estimates the total contribution of EU immigrants as approximately £4.42 billion per year. So clearly, we need to have this matter resolved. The British Medical Association, in a brief, said the NHS cannot afford to put up barriers to medical or other healthcare staff, or to deter staff from coming to work in the health service at a time when they are needed the most. They state the NHS has always relied on international doctors to provide a safe, high quality and reliable level of service for patients and to fill the gaps in the medical workforce. In 2018, nearly 85,000 doctors working in the NHS, approximately 37% of the medical workforce, received their primary medical qualification from another country outside the UK. These highly skilled doctors from the EU and overseas are essential members of the UK's medical and academic workforce. They have enhanced the UK's health, higher education and research systems over the years, improving the diversity of the profession to reflect a changing population, bringing expertise to the NHS and higher education, and filling shortages in specialists and specialities which may otherwise have struggled to cope. Scotland will continue to need and recruit from the EEA and overseas simply and flexibility to sustain staffing levels across the NHS, and we know that in Scotland, Presiding Officer. So anyone who bought into the lies of this Tory Brexit should look at what the medical profession are saying. Scottish Labour believe that the settled status scheme must be reformed to make it simpler and ensure that EU citizens retain their rights in our country. Nothing else will do.
Thank you very much. I now call Liam MacArthur. Mr MacArthur, please.
Officer, I'm grateful for this opportunity to restate the unwavering support of Scottish Liberal Democrats for the rights of EU citizens, not just in Scotland but across the UK. And I have to say I have an enormous amount of respect for Donald Cameron, who I've always found very thoughtful and considered in his contributions. I've listened carefully to what he had to say, and I have to say it's simply not borne out by the reality on the ground, or indeed the lived experience for those at the sharp end, EU nationals, EEA nationals and others. And I think in terms of accusations of scaremongering around the situation facing EU nationals in this country, I think Alex Rowley was absolutely right in suggesting that this is a bit rich coming from the party who has been at it in terms of scaremongering around immigration in the run-up to the Brexit referendum and since. There are many tragedies, of course, in the self-inflicted harm of Brexit, and the truth is that any form of Brexit will be damaging to the UK. Yet it's hard to think of an aspect of Brexit that reflects us in a poorer light than the way in which successive Tory governments have sought to use EU nationals in this country as pawns in a wider political game of brinkmanship. Theresa May made no attempt to disguise this fact. Boris Johnson and colleagues have positively revelled in it. For them, ending freedom of movement is the Holy Grail, as if removing rights we currently have is a good thing. Even arguing that it's about removing rights that others have makes little sense. Economically, culturally and as a society, putting up barriers, closing ourselves off, making ourselves less open or welcoming is akin to cutting off our nose to spite our face. As the motion today makes clear, in-migration has enriched our communities in our country, turning our backs on this risk, making us poorer and less able to meet the challenges we already face. It's a fact, for example, that Scotland already struggles to cope with skills shortages in key areas. Rural parts of our country have some of the most acute teacher shortages in Europe. Last summer, reports began emerging of a decrease in the number of EU teachers applying with the GTCS. Only 14 EU teachers applying for registration up until the end of June 2018, a dramatic drop compared to previous years, where the figure was nearer 200. Even so, in March this year, there were still 523 teachers from EU countries registered to teach in Scotland. One of those is a constituent, Antoine Pietri. Antoine recently wrote to me to explain what he has been put through over recent years, an experience no doubt all too familiar for many in a similar position in communities across Scotland and the rest of the UK. Antoine says, I have felt deeply offended and discriminated against by a country which so far had been very good to me and which in return I've been very grateful towards. I've been employed by Orkney Islands Council as a French assistant and then as a teacher since 24th August 1994, the day I entered the UK and made my life here in Orkney. Antoine goes on to add, for over a quarter of a century, I have shared my knowledge and trained young people across the islands on Hoy, Stronsay and Sandy, and I now teach their children. I've been involved in charity work, been a committee member of various associations and now a trustee of the Friends of St Nicholas, and I could go on. Doesn't it look like I'm settled enough already? Why should I have to prove it to the UK government? Why indeed, Deputy Presiding Officer? But this Brexit effect is not limited, of course, to our education system. Like the rest of the UK, Scotland has an ageing population. The number of people aged 75 and over has increased by a third in the last 20 years. Discouraging EU citizens from coming to the UK or staying will have potentially disastrous effects on the ability of our NHS and care services to meet the consequences of the demographic challenges we face. The Tory amendment heralds their proposed NHS visa as some sort of saviour in this regard, but nothing could be further from the truth. Surcharging EU health professionals £400 per year to work in our NHS will do nothing to stem the exodus of EU nurses leaving the country, 5,000 in the last 2 years. The NHS currently relies on 10,000 doctors and 20,000 nurses from elsewhere in the EU. Slapping on a nurses' tax is no way to persuade them to stay or others to come in future. Meanwhile, a newly qualified GP looking to make her home in Orkney has found herself embroiled in the fallout from Brexit. Writing to me recently, she explained how obstructive the government's registration scheme is and how impractical for those like her living and working in the island communities. To apply without an Android phone, my constituents were initially forced to travel to Edinburgh to make the application at an ID checkpoint, a process as inconvenient as it was demeaning. In the case of my constituent, it means that despite early access to the application process, she still doesn't have her settled status confirmed, and she is by no means alone. I appreciate the Minister's comments about the reliability of some of the figures, but it does appear around 2.7 million EU citizens in the UK are still without settled status. There may be those who do not wish to apply, but putting in place policies that deter those who do is self-defeating. We simply can't afford to take such an approach, given the gaps we already have in key parts of our workforce. And by forcing our friends, neighbours and colleagues to be processed through a settlement scheme, we must be clear what this entails. The settlement scheme is not intended to make anyone feel welcome. In that respect, it performs its function superbly well. It doesn't confirm rights in an empathetic or a positive way. It interrogates the decision of individuals and families to come to this country in the first place. It hangs a threat of deportation over the heads of people who have offered to our country their skills, creativity, experience, and so much more. These are our fellow citizens whose contribution to our communities and our country goes well beyond the economic. They help shape our identity and who we are. They are our friends, neighbours, work colleagues, and family. They deserve better. Deputy Presiding Officer, for my two constituents and thousands like them across communities in Scotland and the UK, we must do better. I am in no doubt the best way to do that is to stop Brexit. And on that basis, I support the motion and the amendment in the name of Claire Baker. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Open debate, speeches of 6 minutes, a little time in hand for interventions. Annabel Ewing, followed by Alexander Stewart. Ms Ewing, please.
Thank you, Presiding Officer, and I am pleased to have been called to speak in this important debate this afternoon. For the position of EU citizens in Scotland is an issue that is important to me on a personal as well as on a political level. And indeed, I have very close friends who are EU nationals and who have made their lives here over the past 30 years or so. They have set up businesses here. They have paid their taxes here. They have paid their national insurance contributions here. They have created employment here. They have met their partners here. They have had children here. And they hope to retire here. And whilst my friends have applied for settled status, it was done with a heavy heart and has caused much upset for them and for their families. For they feel, Presiding Officer, as if they have been othered by the UK government. That is to say that their participation in our society is no longer based on rights, but rather on the vagaries of administrative policy driven by the anti-immigration rhetoric of Westminster. And they feel too a great sadness that the UK has embarked on such a course, well remembering the history of the continent of Europe and the fundamental objective of the EU, and that is to bring peace, and was indeed to bring peace to a war-ravaged Europe through trade and cooperation. Turning to the EU settlement scheme, a subject which I spoke about in the members' debate that I secured in March of this year, I would wish to reiterate that my objection to this scheme is first and foremost one of principle. For as a lawyer by trade and one who practised EC law in Brussels for some 10 years, I find it abhorrent that the UK Tory government is forcing individual citizens who have legally acquired rights further to international treaty to make an application for rights that they already have. Aside from that fundamental objection, Presiding Officer, the practicalities of the scheme leave a lot to be desired and take no account, as we have heard, of the position of many individuals who do not have ease of access to making an online application. Also, and importantly, the successful applicant does not receive, as we have heard, any physical piece of paper at the end of the process. Rather, there will be an electronic link only. And I wonder who in this chamber would be satisfied with such an approach if it was their family member who was placed in such an invidious position. And given, Presiding Officer, the dreadful record of the UK Home Office as far as immigration matters in general are concerned, surely we should all feel uncomfortable that it is this dysfunctional department which will hold such sway over people's lives. And we must remember in this respect that there is currently no proper right of appeal, but rather provision in the first instance for an administrative review only. Taking all of the above points into account, I would wholeheartedly wish to support the calls from the Scottish Government, from the SCVO, the Scottish Human Rights Consortium and others for the system to be overhauled and for a declaratory system to be put in its place. This would avoid the need for citizens to make applications and would remove the threat of refusal except in the most extreme circumstances. Given that the EU27 have the option of proceeding with such a system for UK passport holders living in their countries, there is no reason why the UK cannot so proceed here. Indeed, a declaratory system is a much fairer approach, for it removes the uncertainty and anxiety surrounding applying for settled status. And by removing the role of the Home Office in effect as judge and jury, it would be much more likely to increase the numbers of those applying. As we have heard, applications for settled status have been on the low side to date, and we must, each of us, do all we can to encourage our fellow citizens from other countries in the EU to stay here in Scotland. For Scotland is enriched by EU nationals choosing to make Scotland their home. Our economy is also boosted by their contributions in many sectors, including in the food and drink sector, with many EU nationals forming part, for example, of the 600+ strong workforce at Murray's salmon processing operations in Rosyth in my constituency. And EU nationals are driving our population growth, vitally important given the demographics of Scotland, which has an ageing population. As we have heard, the Scottish Government is doing all it can to help people to be able to stay with its Stay in Scotland package and guidance for both EU nationals and for employers. Also, funding, of course, has been made available, as we have heard, by the Scottish Government to Citizens Advice Scotland, and indeed in my constituency of Cowdenbeath, the local bureau has a dedicated EU settlement support worker. That worker has been in place since April and has, at least by September, dealt with some 60+ cases. Presiding Officer, who would ever have imagined that we here in 21st century Scotland would live to see the day when such an ugly policy would be the law of the land? That is not who we are in Scotland, Presiding Officer. We did not vote for this, and we will not put up with this. And to conclude, I think it is important to reiterate once again what Scotland's First Minister Nicola Sturgeon said to each EU citizen in Scotland following the announcement of the results of the EU referendum in 2016, a result in Scotland which saw 62% of our population voting to remain in the EU. Nicola Sturgeon, the First Minister, said, and I absolutely echo what she said, and I would like to convey that in particular to my constituents of Cowdenbeath who are from other EU countries. You remain welcome here. Scotland is your home and your contribution is valued. Thank you, Presiding Officer.
Thank you. I call Alexander Stewart, who followed by Stuart McMillan. Mr. Stewart, please.
Thank you, Deputy Presiding Officer. I am pleased to be able to take part in today's debate on the rights of EU citizens in Scotland. It's important to mention at this stage that the Scottish Conservatives absolutely acknowledge that EU citizens' contributions to Scotland, and indeed extremely beneficial and highly positive both socially, culturally and economically, They are most welcome and we wish for them to remain. The UK Government has always recognised this as an important fact. The referendum result in itself has no immediate effect on nationality residence or social security status of EU citizens in the UK. The status of EU citizens and the family members has to be protected under UK immigration law, and that will not change. The UK Government has also set up the EU settlement scheme, which is in line with the withdrawal agreement and is specifically designed for that entire purpose. Moreover, to highlight the position, in September this year, the Home Secretary indicated that after Brexit, the government will take back control by introducing a new, fairer immigration system that prioritises skills and what people can contribute to the United Kingdom rather than where they come from. And that's vitally important, Deputy Presiding Officer. The UK Government has already said that EU citizens' rights will be guaranteed. They are guaranteed. This will come and we are sure that the free movement on temporary levels to remain in the scheme until it happens. This will ensure minimum disruption while they put in the final arrangements in place to map out a new course for a much fairer system going forward. The United Kingdom Government has recognised the need to provide EU citizens, employers and others with certainty about the arrangements that will take place after Brexit. Deputy Presiding Officer, as I've said in this chamber before, people voted to leave for many different reasons. For some, it was a question of sovereignty. For others, it was about economic opportunities. Yes, and for some, it was about greater control over immigration. However, it was not about rejecting immigration altogether. In anticipation of these changes, the UK Government has already commissioned the Migration Advisory Committee to assess other international countries and point-based methods. And in the preparation, the Home Secretary wrote back in September for the UK moving towards a point-based immigration system. This will ensure that Scotland in the United Kingdom continues to attract the best and the brightest talent from around the world. Indeed, it is extremely opportunity, and as we've said in the past, the SNP themselves saw this as an immigration system when they were introducing their 2013 white paper as a solution to what would happen here in Scotland. As too often has been the case, that the SNP have spent significant amounts of time, valued energy, blaming Westminster and criticising the government for their immigration policy. Deputy Presiding Officer, that stage we should be looking to put grievance politics on the back burner. And I want to indicate an example that took place recently, which happened back in March, when a mailing was sent out using taxpayers' money from the offices of Alan Smith MEP. A letter was sent to EU citizens in Stirling, part of my own region, Mid Scotland and Fife, and this letter caused confusion, fear and anxiety. It advised that the UK Prime Minister had spoken about EU citizens in a shameful manner, when Theresa May had consistently ensured that their rights were to be protected. However, we in Scotland and the Scottish Conservatives have ensured that when it comes to sectors, we will look at them, and we have already, and I give examples of agriculture. We believe that the future of farming lies in increased productivity, but we recognise that with the soft fruit and vegetable farmers, the technology is not yet available for that to happen. That is why we campaigned for and delivered a pilot scheme to bring non-EU seasonal workers to the UK to deliver work for our farmers that was needed. We have continued to listen to that and in the farming sector, and that is why we have quadrupled that quota by having dialogue and discussion. Now, I wish to continue to ensure that that quota is quadrupled for the next year. After pressure from the Scottish Conservatives, and I pay tributes to Ruth Davison and Liz Smith, the United Kingdom also announced the reintroduction of a 2-year post-study work visa. This has been welcomed right across the sector, and that was put in place by us having dialogue and discussion with our counterparts at Westminster. In conclusion, Deputy Presiding Officer, we all need to engage in collective and cooperative dialogue about how we can deliver a better immigration policy that reflects the work here in Scotland. That is why the Scottish Conservatives have always done that when it comes to migration policy. No, we have not always immediately agreed with our Westminster colleagues' approach, but what we have done is to make positive and proactive suggestions. By having that positive dialogue, it has ensured that the approach has always paid dividends, and we will continue to ensure that that is the case, because we do value these individuals. We wish them to stay because they make a valued contribution to our society, and I support the amendment.
Thank you very much. I call Stuart McMillan, who will be followed by Lewis MacDonald. Mr McMillan, please.
Thank you very much, Presiding Officer. Presiding Officer, I'm both Scottish and European, and also a nationalist and an internationalist, and I fully support the motion in the name of the Minister. And I would urge the Chamber to speak with one voice tonight at 5 p.m. when we have the vote, to actually tell all of our EU friends who have chosen to live here that they are welcome. EU citizens are clearly concerned about their status. They're clearly worried about what's going to happen to them in a post-Brexit scenario. And I want them to stay. I want them to continue to contribute to our country, our economy, our culture, and also socially. Now, I previously sent a letter to all the EU nationals in my Greenock and Inverclyde constituency, providing them with information available at the time, but also reaffirming the fact that they are welcome here. Now, some of the responses I received were full of gratitude, but they also wanted to say thank you for that reaffirmation. They also wanted to thank the First Minister for her continued support and her continued comments indicating that all EU nationals are welcome in Scotland. Now, Presiding Officer, it's important that no matter what politicians talk about and no matter what figures we actually bandy about when we have debates in this chamber and also in committees and also outside of the Parliament, we have to remember that these EU citizens are individual people. The plight that they have at the moment is something that the UK government can fix readily if they want to. But also, it's not just about the adults, it's about the children as well. These individuals, they go about their business, they contribute to their working environment, they contribute to making Scotland better. Now, I thank them for choosing Scotland as the country that they actually want to live in, and I thank them for actually calling Scotland their home. Now, I don't believe that any member of this Parliament would be pleased if the state told them that the circumstances were going to change. I don't believe that any member of this chamber would be pleased if they believed that their home might no longer be theirs if they were not allowed to live here anymore. I think that this is where the SCVO comments in the briefings provided to us were actually was very helpful, and which Alec Rowley touched upon earlier. I think one of the quotes was that, from the SCVO was that we will now be required to apply for permission to stay in their own homes and communities. Presiding Officer, the UK government record in dealing with immigrants has not always been one to be proud of. The Windrush scandal proves this to be the case. If Windrush tells us anything, it tells us, and also now EU citizens living here, that the UK government cannot be trusted on immigration. We all heard the stories of individuals going to visit family and friends in the Caribbean, only some of them to only be refused entry when they came back to the UK. We also know that some people died when they left, when they went to go and visit. Their homes were in the UK. Their lives were in the UK. Saying also, I don't blame EU citizens for being scared and apprehensive. I would be if I was in their situation. The UK government EU settle scheme and settled status scheme is frustrating enough, but for those EU nationals who have lived here for less than the 5 years, they're only able to apply for the pre-settled status. This provides even less security for the applicant or their children, a guaranteed right to remain. This is just shocking. Now, Daniel Hannan, the Tory MEP, and I thought his quote actually was very useful in this regard, and he's quoted as saying, I have had constituency cases of EU nationals being denied settled status despite living here for years. This is a breach of the assurances I and other Leavers gave during the referendum. Now, Presiding Officer, Scotland is in this mess because of the demonising of migrants and the surge to the right in UK politics. UKIP, the BNP and the EDL and others have actually, unfortunately, helped sway some people by claiming that migrants are not welcome. The Conservatives' actions are also well documented, as we know, with Windrush and also the Go Home van, and we also had Labour's infamous controls in the migration mug. This despite parties in this Parliament agreeing that immigration into Scotland is both positive but also essential. I'm going to just a bit of a paragraph from the Equal Opportunities Committee report, which was the Migration and Trafficking report in 2010. Now, some of the members of that committee are still in Parliament today. And it was paragraph 689, and it states, the committee believes that in this report it has been able to dispel many of the myths that have grown around migration. It found in evidence, for example, that migrants' demands on public services, including the health service, are not as high as the general populations, that migrants are housed largely in private rented accommodation rather than social housing, and that migrants do not depress local wages. And also more generally, there is also evidence available which states that migrants pay more in taxes than they receive in benefits and public services. Presiding Officer, as the BMA Scotland briefing for today also told us, the NHS has always relied on international doctors to provide a safe, high quality and reliable level of service for patients and to fill gaps in the medical workforce. Presiding Officer, we have an ageing population and the number of pensioners are projected to increase further by 25% over the next 25 years, with a population growth over the next 25 years projected to be amongst the lowest across comparative European and UK countries. Then the half-baked and ill-conceived measures by the UK government will not help in any way. They will make it harder for Scotland and also for our constituents. EU citizens, my message to you, and I echo the comments from the First Minister, but my message to every single EU citizen is, you are welcome in Scotland. You are needed in Scotland. And thank you for choosing Scotland as your home. And also, please stay. Thank you.
Lewis MacDonald, followed by Joan McAlpine.
Thank you very much, Presiding Officer. Today's debate is about citizens of other European countries who have chosen to migrate and to make their home in this country. It is also about citizens of member states of the European Economic Area, as the Minister said, countries such as Norway, and people who have not crossed the North Sea on a permanent basis, but who are able to use their freedom of movement within the EEA to work here and to go back to their home country between trips or between contracts. And that is worth noting from the point of view of my own region of the North East. Offshore oil and gas workers from Aberdeen are at least as likely to work in Norwegian waters as they are in the southern North Sea of England or Holland. And Norwegians are just as likely to work here while still living in Norway. There are other economic sectors where the same is true. The loss of that freedom of access will be bad news for those workers and for what is surely the highly desirable objective of economic activity which straddles borders in the North Sea. So it's important to bear those workers in mind while focusing also on those European citizens who have made the huge commitment of leaving their own countries to come to live in ours. Those citizens are already feeling the effects of the Brexit vote, and it is those citizens who are the focus of the Labour amendment today. That amendment highlights the recent report on how Brexit impacts EU citizens' mental health and well-being, carried out by researchers from Robert Gordon University with support from Phoenix. The Minister and I were both fortunate enough to be at the launch of that report in June, and Piotr Todorowski from RGU, who presented at the launch, also wrote up their report in the Scotsman at that time. This report matters because it goes beyond the legal issues of rights and entitlements to look at what the uncertainty of Brexit actually means for the lives of the people most directly affected. The evidence came through focus groups carried out in Edinburgh and in Aberdeen. They featured citizens of 13 different countries who had been in this country since before the referendum in 2016, and the study confirmed just how damaging Brexit has already been for many European citizens who have chosen to make their lives here. The research highlighted three impacts on people's mental health and well-being. First, there was the unravelling of people's future plans. One witness told of putting marriage plans on hold because of citizenship uncertainties. Another was afraid to leave the UK in case it was not possible to get back in. Second, and perhaps most important, there was the sense of rejection. Having been welcomed and made to feel welcome, suddenly here was a public vote which said they were not welcome after all, a public vote in which they, as active citizens and taxpayers, often as volunteers in their own community, were denied the right to participate. Some, of course.
Stuart McMillan.
I thank Lewis MacDonald for taking the intervention. Would Lewis MacDonald agree with me that his comments there echo the same comments that came from the Fife Migrants Forum when Ms MacDonald was a member of the European Committee, when we had evidence from them?
Indeed, I remember that evidence session well, and Stuart McMillan is quite right. And that was at an earlier stage, but nonetheless reflected how quickly that uncertainty impacted on people's lives and people's sense of what they were able to plan and to do. And some of those who responded to the RGU study experienced direct discrimination as a result of the vote. Others were nervous at being marked out as different and were unsure how far even those British citizens who were most sympathetic, how far we could understand how they felt. Thirdly, there was a sense of loss through change. Some participants described it as like mourning. First denial, then sadness, and finally acceptance of their loss. One talked of taking a different way to work to avoid seeing the endless and depressing headlines about Brexit and immigration. Others found that mental ill health, which they already faced, was made worse by depression about the referendum vote or by anxiety about what might happen next. These are consequences of the vote to leave the EU. They are to some degree unintended consequences. Many who voted to leave did not think about the implications for EU citizens any more than they thought about the implications for Gibraltar or for peace in Ireland. But for others, though, including some in the Conservative Party, immigration was at the centre of their campaign to leave, and the pain and loss of EU citizens here and of British citizens elsewhere in the European Union were a price worth paying. Now, this is one of many reports to confirm just how deeply irresponsible that Leave campaign really was. What ultimately happens with Brexit is, as we all know, still to be determined. But whatever the outcome, the underlying sense of rejection for many EU citizens in this country will not just go away. Work will still be needed, even if Brexit is indeed not taken forward. Work will still be needed to convince those people that they really are welcome, not just by some of their neighbours, but by the community and the country as a whole. The motion we are debating today does not propose a different approach in Scotland from the rest of the United Kingdom. The Minister has proposed a different approach on the part of the next UK government to protect EU citizens right across the UK and in the event that Brexit does go ahead, and that is absolutely right and welcome. So the Minister's party and mine will agree on the matters we are debating today, just as we do on the wider impact of Brexit on people's human rights. But we shouldn't ignore the implications of this debate for other potential referendums, also posing hard choices, where some of our fellow citizens may also feel they have a great deal to lose. This report and many other studies on the impact of the Brexit referendum on European citizens are clear. It does not require hostile intentions to have very distressing impacts when it comes to erecting borders that cut through people's lives. And we should all be open to understanding what that might imply for decisions we might take now and in the future.
John McAlpine, followed by Jamie Green.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. The position that EU nationals find themselves in the UK Government's Brexit waiting room is nothing short of scandalous. The abject failure of the UK Government to disseminate information about its own EU settlement scheme has compounded feelings of rejection and anxiety already experienced by EU nationals in the UK, as outlined by Lewis MacDonald. Not only that, but the scheme itself is fundamentally flawed. The 5-year and pre-settled elements disrespect the dignity and rights of people who have contributed so much to our society. The scheme is not fair, it's not proportionate, and delay and uncertainty abounds. None of this is human rights compliant. The settled status scheme should have been scrapped and replaced with the declarative scheme already an option under the Withdrawal Act and as proposed by the Scottish Government. The people who choose to come to Scotland from the European Union make an invaluable contribution. 3/4 are employed, a greater percentage of EU nationals have degrees than UK citizens, and more than 70% own their own homes after living for 10 years in Scotland. With all age groups in Scotland predicted to decline in the next 25 years, the importance of new lifeblood cannot be overstated. Population growth is the main driver of economic growth. All of Scotland's population increase in the next 10 years is projected to come from elsewhere, 58% from overseas. The rise in population and current net migration figures is from 5.4 million to 5.69 million by 2041. It is younger people who migrate to Scotland from the EU, boosting the number of children and working-age people. Scots are right to be worried about anything that undermines population growth or an exodus from Scotland of EU nationals. The Independent Expert Advisory Commission on Migration and Population said that the UK Government's immigration plans mean a decline of migrants by as much as 50% in Scotland, but we know that this figure could be a lot higher. Make no mistake, the loss of freedom of movement will be catastrophic for Scotland's economy. Slowing the population growth will impact hugely on the working population in particular. 5.2% of Scotland's whole workforce is made up of EU nationals. 10,000 people in the food and drink industry, 19,000 in the soft fruit and vegetable industry, 4,000 in fishing, 21,000 in tourism. EU nationals are working in all our universities and research centres, our hotels, restaurants and our manufacturing base. 98% of all Scotland's business enterprise are small businesses, and the Federation of Small Businesses estimates that 26% have at least one EU employee. 41% of all businesses, large and small across Scotland, employ at least one EU national. EU doctors make up approximately 6% of the NHS medical workforce in Scotland, and 1,200 of these are actually medical professionals. But the government's utter failure to communicate its own settled status scheme is evident here. 34% of EEA doctors working in Scotland are not aware of its existence, and 30% are looking to move abroad. NHS staff and patients are having to cope with a vacancy rate of almost 9%. We cannot, and the UK Government must not, expect NHS staff and patients to suffer the harmful and unconscionable consequences that Brexit and the loss of freedom of movement will bring. The impact of EU migration on Scotland's economy is all good. It means increased GDP and government revenue, higher exports, consumption and investment. It is calculated on an inflow of around 7,800 additional employed EU nationals each year, based on trends between 2007 and 2016. Two areas that I am privileged to present, Scottish Borders and Dumfries and Galloway, have experienced a slow and steady overall increase in net in-migration between 2012 and 2018, as official statistics show. Rural areas like these rely heavily on EU migrants for population growth and so economic growth. We know, and others have made the point well, that Scotland will be disproportionately affected by any slowdown in immigration. And that means our economic growth is in severe jeopardy. We want and need in Scotland to increase our labour supply, expanding the production capacity of the Scottish economy. When our economy as a whole is more competitive, all of Scotland's citizens benefit. This is the future that the UK Government seek to deny Scotland. It is not acceptable, and it is time that our success is not predicated on the woeful decisions of the Westminster farce that is Brexit. In contrast to the lamentable efforts of the UK Government, the Scottish Government has communicated regularly and purposefully with EU nationals living here about the ramifications of Brexit. We want people to stay, to build, to share in Scotland's success. The settled status scheme does not help Scotland build for the future that we want. The scheme is a mess, and I support the Scottish Government's call for a declarative scheme that is fair, respectful and should be given the full force of the law as soon as possible. Thank you.
Jamie Green, followed by Fulton McGregor.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. I'll be clear from my first comments. I have always welcomed, both in this chamber and outside of it, the contribution of both EU and non-EU migrants to Scotland. And I want to see them continue to be welcomed onto our shores, even after we leave the European Union. We cannot underestimate the important role that they play in our society and our economy. That contribution, especially in our rural economies, is enormous. Up to 10,000 people employed in our food and drink sectors, 5,000 in our fishing industry, and 21,000 in the vital tourism industry that Scotland needs. In our academic sectors, in universities, 1/5 of our academic researchers are from the EU. And as of August of this year, EU citizens make up about 4% of our population. So whilst there is a debate here over that contribution, that debate itself is a welcome one. The problem is the tone of the debate surely is not. I would like to add that their contribution is not just economic, though, as many have rightfully said in this debate. Their contribution is about diversifying our country, our society, and enriching it. And any notion otherwise is not one you will ever hear from me or ever hear from these benches. And any suggestion otherwise is disappointing, but not surprising. There have been nearly 93,000 applications for EU settled status in Scotland, but as some have alluded to, there are still deficiencies in take-up of that. And I think there's a duty on all of us, irrespective of our views on Brexit or other matters, that our constituents know about these schemes. And it does raise wider questions as to why, given that we talk about Brexit day in, day out, every day for the last 3 years, why so many have not come forward to do so. And I listened with interest to the Minister's comments on that. And to be fair to him, his actions, in my view, are welcome interventions. If the premise, if I can just make my point, if the premise of that intervention is to increase awareness in certain communities, then it is right to do so. But of course, the settlement scheme itself had flaws when it was introduced, no least the suggestion initially that there would be a fee. And I think the government listened and did the right thing on that. And there remains clearly anecdotal evidence that the scheme is not working perfectly for everyone. We've had briefings from the SCVO and others to that effect. I do listen to people. I listen to those briefings. They talk about delays in the process. They talk about the ability to appeal. And they talk about technical issues with the process itself. That feedback is important. And I think it's feedback that the Home Office ought reflect on. But I still maintain the argument, Presiding Officer, that as a result of the UK's decision to leave the EU, and if it transpires that we leave the market arrangements which currently permit EU-wide free movement of people, whatever your views on that, there still needs to be a physical mechanism for ascertaining who has the right to reside and work in this country. No country in the world with large numbers of immigration is devoid of such a mechanism. And I think this debate boils down to three different groups of people. The first, those who are currently within this country, who come from the EU, and who seek to identify themselves as such. The second, those from the EU who wish to enter the UK after Brexit, and the third being those from non-EU countries who wish to come here to live and work post-Brexit. They are distinct groups, and there are distinct ideas about how we deal with that. But there does seem to be some apathy over some that there should be a process at all. It doesn't occur to us as odd to respect the rules of entry and residence by which we go through when we go to other countries. So why does it seem odd to some that we have our own reciprocal arrangements in this country? I will on that point.
James Dornan.
Can I ask you why you would think that we should have faith in any system that this UK government comes up with, when just today Hubert Howard, who entered this country when he was 3 years old, died 3 weeks after getting his citizenship? He was one of the Windrush immigrants. Why should we trust a system that you put in place when that system was obviously such a dreadful failure?
Jamie Green.
I don't disagree that there are huge lessons to be learnt from the Windrush immigration policy. However, the government has been very clear that those who currently live in this country, who are from the EU, are welcome. They're welcome to stay, and that after we leave the EU, there will be a fair process of immigration, one that I think we need to have a sensible discussion around. I appreciate the member's views on the UK government in Westminster. He's entitled to those views. But what I'm talking about here is a fair and simple process that people need to go through. There is a skill shortage in the UK and indeed in Scotland, and it is right that we have a debate about bringing people in. But I must say we also should be having a conversation about attracting talent from outside of the EU and indeed attracting talent from the other nations of the UK. Future immigration policy, in my view, should be about making everyone feel welcome equally in Scotland. And the Minister's motion today is odd in some way because it asks this chamber to agree that EU citizens' rights should be protected in primary legislation. I don't disagree with that, but it was called a withdrawal agreement, and it did just that. Indeed, the whole point of a transition period in the first place was to offer that continuity to give people time to prepare. And it is regrettable that so many voted against that transition and so many voted against the guarantees of enshrining these measures into law. It is regrettable that so many MPs did so, including the entirety of the SNP benches, on 4 occasions to do that. And herein lies the hypocrisy of the government's position on this. They call for action in this chamber and then vote against it in another. So what next, Presiding Officer? Well, whatever withdrawal agreement is presented to the UK Parliament, it is out of our hands. But if and when such a deal is presented, a deal which enshrines the rights of EU citizens, it should be supported. Actions speak louder than words. The big question, Presiding Officer, is when it comes to securing EU citizens' rights, will the SNP practice what they preach? Only time will tell.
Fulton McGregor, followed by George Adam.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. It's an honour to speak today and represent directly the views, wishes and concerns of EU citizens in my constituency. Since June 2016 and that Brexit vote, this SNP government have been unwavering in its commitment to EU citizens who have given this country the honour of choosing to live, work and bring up their families here. The message is both clear and simple. You are welcome and we want you to stay. And just a few weeks ago, as others have mentioned, on the day that we were supposed to leave the EU, the First Minister wrote her third open letter to all EU citizens in Scotland. The letter recognised the benefits and contributions of EU citizens here and finished with the assertion that you will always be welcome here. And although Brexit has caused anxiety among EU citizens living in the UK, studies have shown that EU citizens in Scotland feel more welcome than EU citizens in England and the rest of the UK. And this is a sad indictment on the UK government and symptomatic of the way that they have handled this whole Brexit shambles. Because we know, Presiding Officer, that EU citizens contribute socially, culturally and economically to Scotland's rich diversity. On that point, I will agree with Jamie Green. However, the uncertainty of the last 2.5 years have put this diversity at risk. The UK Government has given EU citizens until mid-2021 to apply for the EU settlement scheme, though in the event of a no deal, this application must be completed before the end of next year. In a joint briefing that we would have received from the Scottish Council for Voluntary Organisations and the Human Rights Consortium Scotland pointed to the huge number of flaws in the current scheme application system, and I know that other members have spoken to that. My constituency office, I'm sure like every other constituency office here, have heard of several instances whereby a simple mistake or a wrongly ticked box has created immense delays and stress in dealing with the Home Office. We are dealing with a very time-sensitive issue here, so I agree with the Government's motion to adopt a declarative system instead of the current application system. It would be quicker, fairer and less likely to cause stress to those EU citizens in all our constituencies. And on this point, Presiding Officer, I want to talk about the Tory contributions today. Donald Cameron and his colleagues who have put up their argument, they almost sound like they believe it, but I don't know who they can be possibly talking to. They're certainly not talking to the EU citizens that come in to see me who are worried about their future, about the EU citizens that are getting made jump through hurdles and hoops. And they talk about the number of applications, and we should all be encouraging our constituents to go through this application process. But not one of them have mentioned that this application process involves finding original flight details often, providing job details, providing bank accounts, GP appointments. One constituent told me that to provide every single prescription. What? You know, sometimes I just think, how can they possibly believe that themselves? Is sticking up for the Prime Minister and his policies more important than sticking up for constituents? They really need to be asking themselves that question, Presiding Officer. And I can assure the Chamber that there is a lot of stress. I've said that. Last December, like many other members in here, I held a packed surgery in my own constituency for EU citizens. And I know that many of them were concerned about the homes that they had bought, the rights of their children who were born here, where they stood with permanent jobs and pensions, access to healthcare, and many other factors. These, Presiding Officer, are new Scots, are our family, friends, neighbours, and the current system and the current process is making them feel like second-class citizens. It's absolutely shameful. It's horrendous, and the shame will likely be recorded in history, in the UK and British history, as an epic national scandal. And others have already said, Presiding Officer, I won't go over all the points about the benefits that EU citizens bring to Scotland. And I do agree with Jamie Green on that point. They bring so much benefits, diversity, there are friends, there are family, and of course, economic benefits. 1 in 20 workers in Scotland are EU citizens. If they were to leave, industries such as food and drink, tourism, manufacturing and fishing would be disproportionately affected. We need EU citizens in this country. In summary, Presiding Officer, this is an issue that at its heart is quite simple. It's not really about policies, frameworks, quotas and statistics. They're all helpful, but it's not really about that. It's about basic humanity, love, friendship and essential human rights. You either stand for these things or you don't. And as elected politicians in this chamber who are elected by the people of Scotland, shame on any who aren't willing to stand up for our friends and neighbours, our constituents. This UK government clearly doesn't care about EU citizens, and it's just one more reason, Presiding Officer, why many more people are coming to the realisation that the future as a normal nation, as part of the European Union, is right and the most sensible path for us to take. Thank you.
The last of the open debate contributions is from George Adam.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. Presiding Officer, I'm delighted to speak in this debate today and would like to begin by reiterating what many of my colleagues and friends have said before me. We in Scotland did not vote to leave the European Union, and we certainly don't wish to see our European friends and neighbours leave our shores. It's undisputed that EU migrants have a positive effect on the Scottish economy. They help us drive our population growth and ensure we have workers to meet the needs of businesses and the public sector. So from the get-go, this Scottish Government has been committed to protecting the rights of the EU citizens living and working in our country. Presiding Officer, I often think to myself how these families must feel with all the current uncertainty coming from Westminster at this moment. How would I feel if I was in a very similar situation? The uncertainty and the fear of what may come. They chose Scotland as their home, and we want them to remain here, and they need our support during these uncertain times. And that brings me to some of the contributions that we've had today. And Donald Cameron, one in particular, where he actually says we agree with most of what the Minister said during his opening remarks. Now, Donald Cameron may be a nice, jolly nice bloke, and he may be easy to get on with. I don't know myself, Presiding Officer. But at the end of the day, his speech and the tone of his speech was somewhat disappointing in this debate. He actually used language that I wouldn't have used myself when we're dealing with this, because we're talking about these families, these individuals who are already worrying about these things as well. And one of the things that always strikes me is, you know, they really must stop actually being apologists for the circus that is the UK government. Consistently, they have taken, the UK government is now laughed worldwide because of the situation with Brexit at the moment. And the Conservatives have no idea of what these families are going through, but they still, Presiding Officer, defend this morally bankrupt UK government. I've heard Tory after Tory say how important EU citizens are to Scotland, and I agree with them. I would only ask that they stop bumping their gums here and speak to the ringmaster general, Boris Johnson, and tell him exactly what they think, because that's the difference between the whole thing over the past 3 years. In 3 years since the European referendum. Myself and my colleagues in the SNP have waxed lyrical about the disgrace that is the Brexit process. And frankly, Presiding Officer, it doesn't look like a light will appear at the end of the tunnel anytime soon. I sometimes wonder if there are any lights left on in Westminster at all. Yes, gladly.
Adam Tompkins.
I'm very grateful to George Adam for making an intervention. I'm sorry to interrupt his fine electoral rhetorical flourishes, but I want to quote to him something which the current Home Secretary in Boris Johnson's government has said and invite him to explain to the Chamber where and how he disagrees with it. This is what the Home Secretary has said. We want to introduce a new, fairer immigration system that prioritises skills and what people can contribute to the United Kingdom rather than where they come from. That's the government's immigration policy. Does George Adam agree with it or not?
George Adam. One thing I've learned, Mr Tompkins, is Boris Johnson is very good at making a speech and saying things out loud, but what he actually delivers is never the same as what he says in there. So it's a matter of trust. It's a matter of trust. But during the recent parliamentary recess period, Presiding Officer, I became keenly aware that many of my constituents are growing increasingly concerned about the potential ramifications that leaving the EU could bring and how it will affect their communities and their families. Not only are we facing possible food shortages, increased electricity prices and gas prices and more expensive medication, but dragging Scotland out of the EU against our will opens the door for our communities to lose valued and contributing members. And for me personally, as someone whose wife has a long-term condition, 3 long-term conditions, the looming Brexit dark clouds appears darker still. Most of Stacey's medication comes from mainland Europe, and I've had reassurance from the Scottish Government they're working to sort this out. But there are those in the UK Government to worry about, and though that does not fill me with confidence. But there are many families dealing with long-term conditions who have this fear, and quite frankly, they have all lost faith in Westminster. The recent report of the Migration Advisory Committee commissioned by the UK Government dispels many of the myths about the economic impact of EU migrants under freedom of movement. Let's be clear, EU citizens are not a drain in public services or public finances. In fact, the truth is to the contrary. It is clear from that report that immigration overall has made the UK a more productive economy and a more prosperous nation. Approximately 5.2% of Scotland's total workforce is made up of EU migrants. And the rural economy, particularly relying on people from all over the EU. To name but a few, up to 10,000 EU citizens are employed in food and drink industry in Scotland, and we know how much important that industry is to us. And 10,000 non-UK seasonal migrant workers are employed in soft fruit and vegetable sector. Over 4,500 EU citizens work in Scotland's fishing industry and food standards. In all seriousness, EU nationals are vital to our economy and the way of life up here in Scotland. Look at our tourist industry, something that I think we are all proud of. An estimated 21,000 EU citizens are employed in the tourism sector. Presiding Officer, as we live in these uncertain times, I want EU nationals in Scotland to be under no illusions that here in Scotland we value every living and working member of them in this country. And I hope EU citizens will still call our country home for years to come. For me, Presiding Officer, it's quite simple. There are many of these EU citizens living in Paisley in my constituency. If they choose Paisley as their home, then they're as much of a buddy as I am.
We now move to the closing speeches, and I call Alex Rowley for around 7 minutes, please.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. We certainly have had an interesting discussion and debate today, and it is a pity it's against the backdrop of the settled status scheme, because it is important that we do discuss immigration and the importance of immigration to Scotland. I noted that Professor Tompkins intervened on George Adam and talked about what a minister was talking about, a fairer immigration system. But the reality is that Brexit and the whole Brexit campaign, much of it was dominated on ending free movement, as if free movement was a really bad thing for the country. And as politicians, we need to be able to take that on board, because I think most of us in here would acknowledge at some point when we've been on the doorsteps that the issue of immigration and the perception that immigration is a bad thing has come up and does come up on the doors. And very often we fail to actually take that argument on board, we also fail to acknowledge that a shortage of housing, a failure to get access to the NHS, a failure to get access to good education, it's easy, if you like, to blame the immigrants. And that is often what happens, and that's why, as politicians, we need to have these discussions and the positive aspects of immigration that come out today.
Stuart McMillan.
Thank Alex Rowley for taking the intervention. Can I suggest to all colleagues in the Chamber that the report that was published, as I spoke about earlier, the report that was published by the Equal Opportunities Committee in this Parliament in 2010 is a very good starter to actually get those arguments over to the wider population.
Alex Rowley.
Yeah, I'm grateful for that, but it is important. I do believe that if politicians at a UK level in particular, but at every level, had not ducked these questions, we perhaps would not have Brexit today, and that's why it's important that we do have the discussion. I was also reminded, somebody mentioned the UK Parliament Scottish Affairs Committee, and I was reminded that when they were taking evidence on the report that they did, there was somebody from an employment agency in Eastern Europe giving evidence, and he said that many people, when they come in, there's two things that they don't want. They don't want to pick fruit, and they don't want to come to Scotland. And you know, that in itself is an issue. And I make that reference because I would acknowledge, and I think the Minister would acknowledge, that there are specific challenges and issues for Scotland when it comes to encouraging people to come here and make their home here. And that's why certainly the Labour Party in Scotland is open to having further discussions with all parties, because we have to recognise that moving forward, we absolutely need more people to come here and to settle here. And that's why, as many people have said, we're in this crazy position that we're in, where people are being discouraged. The BMA highlighting a lot of medical professionals who may not want to stay here, and that would be a real disaster for us. Lewis MacDonald also highlighted the uncertainty that the impact that uncertainty has on people's lives, and the issues around mental health, with many people being depressed. And you can understand that, because most people I speak to are actually depressed about Brexit and want to see us get a solution to that. But that solution can't be a worse deal than Mrs May's deal, which I do believe Boris Johnson offers us. And the best way forward is to go back to the people and ask them, is this really what they wanted at the end of the day? Joan McAlpine says that the scheme is fundamentally flawed, and many others say that, but it's difficult for me to see where Donald Cameron and the Tory benches are coming from, because I'm not asking you to listen to what I say, or Joan McAlpine, or anybody else for that matter. Look at all the briefs that have come in for people on the front line, for our NHS, for the third sector. All those briefs are saying that the scheme as it currently stands is fundamentally flawed, and that we need to take action. Hence my question earlier to the Minister about putting more resources in, welcoming the resources that have been put in, but we do need more resources. So I cannot for the life of me understand why the Tory benches can come along here today and say, as Alexander Stewart put it, this grieving politics, put it on the back benches. It's not grieving politics, it is listening to all those organisations out there. It's seeing what the real threat is to our NHS and to so many other areas. If many of those people who have chosen to stay in Scotland end up choosing to leave Scotland, we will be in deep trouble. So it's not, as Alexander Stewart puts it, about grieving politics, it's the facts. And you have to, as Professor Tompkins often says, follow the evidence. Well, the evidence is that we have a real problem with the scheme. And as a result of that, Presiding Officer, we need to think again. I would urge the Tories to join with every other party in here, follow the evidence, and let's get this scheme changed so that people are not having to go through what they're going through right now. Thank you.
Adam Tompkins, a generous 9 minutes.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. There's a lot in that, not everything, but a lot in that speech by Alec Rowley that I agree with. I thought it was a very thoughtful set of contributions. Presiding Officer, on these benches, I think across the whole entire chamber, it's true that everybody here values the contribution that is made by EU citizens to all aspects of life in Scotland. And we agree, we do agree very strongly with the opening words of the government's motion today in Ben Macpherson's name. And these are, he's right, this is an important issue, and it's important that everybody who speaks about this issue in this Parliament puts on record the extent to which we all welcome citizens to Scotland and to the rest of the UK from the EU and indeed from elsewhere in the world. Likewise, we all of us recognise the significant contributions that EU citizens make to Scotland and to the whole of the UK, socially, culturally and economically. These are the words of the government, the opening words of the government motion, and we agree with them. And Alec Rowley is absolutely right that we need to have an honest debate about immigration. And that honesty requires us to say those welcoming words, which are not just, boilerplate. They are genuinely meant. But we also need to be honest about the drawbacks of uncontrolled immigration. Immigration is not an unalloyed good. It comes with difficulties as well as benefits. And we need to be honest and candid, both about the positives of immigration and about where we have got immigration wrong in the past. Presiding Officer, we all know that the Scottish economy depends particularly on EU migrant labour, particularly in two sectors of the economy. First, in the rural economy, where we know that up to 10,000 European citizens are employed in food and drink. In Scotland, we know that up to 10,000 non-UK seasonal migrant workers are employed in the soft fruit and vegetable sector in Scotland. We know that 4,500 EU citizens work in the Scottish fishing industry. And we also know that in the sector of the economy that I know best, and I declare an interest as an employee of the University of Glasgow, in the higher education market, there is a very significant and very welcome element of European labour. Labour doesn't sound quite the right word for what academics do, Presiding Officer, but there it is, in a very important part of the employment market. 14% of researchers in Scotland are from non-EU foreign countries, and 67% are from the UK, and 19% are from the EU. Scotland needs, this is the important, these are all statistics that we're familiar with, Presiding Officer, this is the importance of them. Scotland needs migrant labour, both from the European Union and from beyond. And the Scottish Conservatives have consistently campaigned for a UK-wide immigration policy that recognises, that supports and that accommodates that need. That's why Scottish Conservatives, led by Kirstine Hare, have campaigned for an increase to the seasonal agricultural workers scheme, as Donald Cameron said, an increase that has now been delivered by this Conservative government. That's why Scottish Conservatives, led by my friend and colleague Liz Smith, have campaigned for the post-study work visa to be reintroduced, a policy that has now been adopted by the current Boris Johnson government. Two minutes, and I will happily give way. And that's why Scottish Conservatives have said that the £30,000 salary threshold recommended by the Migration Advisory Committee, frankly, will not work for Scotland. And that's why Scottish Conservatives have welcomed the Prime Minister's most recent announcement for a new NHS visa route benefiting healthcare professionals. We recognise the need in the Scottish economy for migrant labour. We welcome it and we support it, and our policies underscore that. Happy to give way to Mr McCarthy.
Liam MacArthur.
I'm very grateful to Adam Tompkins for giving way, and I think I have a great deal of sympathy with much of what he's just said. But what he's described is very transactional. It talks to the economic impact, if you like, that EU nationals and other immigrants make to our communities. But they make a far more significant contribution across a range of factors, the creative contribution they make, which cannot be measured by the transactional mechanisms that he has outlined that the UK government seems to be pushing forward.
Adam Tompkins.
I agree with that unreservedly. I mean, I'm just talking at the moment about the economic benefits because it's been the focus of so much of the debate. But I have no argument with Mr MacArthur whatsoever about the social and about the cultural benefits of that enrich our communities and our society in all of the manners, in all of the ways in which he's just described. He's absolutely right about that. And I don't think anybody in this chamber disagrees with any of those points. Where the government motion, in our view, goes wrong, Presiding Officer, I've talked about where we agree with Mr Macpherson's motion, but where we think it goes wrong is where it talks about insecurity and anxiety. And the opening words of his opening speech that opened this afternoon's debate were to talk about uncertainty. And I very much recognise that there is insecurity, anxiety and uncertainty. I very much regret that there is insecurity, anxiety and uncertainty, but we have to be absolutely clear, Presiding Officer, about why we have this. And it's caused, I'm afraid, by those, including the SNP, who have consistently refused to back our carefully negotiated withdrawal agreement. That withdrawal agreement guarantees the rights of EU nationals lawfully resident in the United Kingdom. That's what the SNP called for, and yet the SNP have voted against it again and again and again. And I'm afraid that's what has caused the very uncertainty that the SNP now complains about. Now, the government motion also insists that the existing rights of EU nationals lawfully resident in the United Kingdom should be maintained and that people should not have to apply for rights that they currently have. And I'm sorry, but I just have to say to Mr Macpherson, I think this argument is misconceived. And I think it's misconceived for reasons that were touched on in Alec Rowley's remarks a few moments ago. Free movement will end when we leave the European Union, or at least it will end at the end of the transition period. Now, free movement is a nice phrase, but what does it mean? What it means is uncontrolled immigration. That is what it has come to mean. I was very interested in what Annabel Ewing, who was a lawyer in Brussels for many years before she turned to elected politics, had to say about this. She said that the European Union was created in order to prosecute peace in Europe through trade. And she's right about that. And when free movement was written into the treaties in the early days of the European Union, it wasn't about free movement. It wasn't about citizens. It wasn't about citizenship. It was about free movement of workers. It was an economic right. It was transactional, to use the word, not at the moment, it was transactional, to use the word that Mr MacArthur was using earlier. But it has become so much more than that under the uncontrolled EU law. Free movement means uncontrolled immigration. And under EU law, as Annabel Ewing surely knows, it is increasingly uncontrolled through the jurisprudence of the Court of Justice. Now, I want to be absolutely candid about this, I want controlled immigration. I don't want uncontrolled immigration. But I want those controls to be fair, I want them to be balanced, and I want them, crucially, to be based on need. I don't particularly care. I will if I have time. I don't particularly care where people come from, Presiding Officer. I care what people can contribute to British and to Scottish society, culture and economy. I want a points-based immigration system that recognises all of this in law. And of course, that's exactly what the SNP said that they would want for an independent Scotland. They want a points-based immigration system. Boris Johnson's government is going to deliver a points-based immigration system, and I think we should all come together to agree and support that. Happy to give way to Annabel Ewing.
Annabel Ewing.
I'm grateful to Adam Tompkins for giving way. Of course, the EU was founded on the 4 fundamental freedoms, being workers, certainly, goods, capital and services. I think it's important to bear that in mind. But going back to the fundamental question here, why should EU citizens who are in Scotland have to apply for rights that they have already acquired? That is the key issue. Why does Adam Tompkins not therefore support a declaratory system?
Adam Tompkins.
The answer is because decisions that are taken in referendums change things. I mean, Annabel Ewing and I were on the same side in the EU referendum campaign. We both campaigned for a Remain vote, and we lost, unfortunately. We lost. And the fact is that referendums decide things, and one of the consequences of the decision that was taken by the British people in that open and democratic referendum was that we were going to have to change aspects of our law, and we were going to bring back control of immigration controls. Presiding Officer, I want to close. I don't know how long I have left, but I want to close by just... I've talked about where I agree and disagree with the government motion. I want to talk a bit about our amendment to that, and to focus in particular on its last words, which are to say that we want an immigration system that ensures that the UK is a place that attracts the best and the brightest talents from around the world. The RSE, Donald Cameron mentioned the RSE, and I should say that I am a fellow of the RSE, although I had nothing to do with the preparation of their work on migration policy, said this: the UK should promote a narrative of being open for business and seen as a welcoming destination for immigrants. It must be clear, in particular, that skilled and talented migrants are both required and valued. And there's much more that the RSE says about that, but in the interests of time, I won't read it all out. Now, I agree with much of what the RSE have said, and this is the point I want to make about it. I think Ben Macpherson does too. I know Ben Macpherson. I know he's capable of reaching out across the aisle and working with political opponents, and I welcome that, and I'd like to see more of it on this and other subjects. And I know there's an election on. I know there's an election on, presiding officer, and I know that we're all politicians. But let's have less of the point scoring and grandstanding, and let's have a bit more of the cross-party working to ensure that we have an immigration system post-Brexit that works for all sectors of the Scottish economy. Thank you.
Call Ben Macpherson, if you could take us up to decision time, please, which is about 12 minutes or so.
Thank you very much, Presiding Officer. And thank you to all members for their contribution to today's really important debate. As Alec Riley said in his summing up, it's so important that in the current context and considering both Scotland's story and Scotland's future, that we talk about issues of immigration and we talk about the value of the people who've come here, the contributions that they make and have made to our economy, our public services, our shared culture, and the welfare and enrichment of our communities. But also how we continue to attract people, both from within the UK, and indeed we have net migration into Scotland from the rest of the UK, and the expert advisory group will look at how we, what more can be considered around that in response to a point Jamie Green raised as well. And we continue to consider overall immigration policy around Scotland's needs and aspirations and values, and how we continue to attract people in any post-Brexit scenario, and indeed continue to make the case for tailored solutions for Scotland. But today's debate, while it's good that we discuss those wider issues, and of course I welcome that, but today's debate is focused on the EU citizens, EEA citizens who are here now and have been here for a long, long time in many cases. It was mentioned that by a number of speakers that it equates to 4% of the population, 221,000 people. But I think we need to think of it in much bigger and much more nuanced ways than just those big numbers. Yes, the amount of people in the different industries that were touched on by a number of speakers is hugely important to understand and value the contributions to different parts of the sectors of Scotland's economy. But today, for me, I think that the most powerful contributions today were those of Liam MacArthur and Fulton McGregor, who talked about individual conversations that they've had as elected members with constituents, and the issues that constituents have faced around dealing with this EU settlement scheme. And it's emotional for that way. And while I recognise the fact that the Conservative Party have said that they value the contributions of EU citizens, I think the members on the Conservative benches need to consider what has been said by others in the Chamber and the stories that have been told in the contributions we've received in evidence and by individuals who are EU citizens across our country, of the sense of rejection that they felt as a result of having to apply to maintain their rights, of the mental health consequences that Lewis MacDonald talked so importantly about, of the sense of feeling degraded as a number of speakers touched upon, including Joe McAlpine. And, you know, I would urge members of the Scottish Conservatives to hold events with EU citizens, like many of us have had around the chamber. Listen to the experiences that EU citizens have had with this application-based process. I'm happy to come along if you want to organise one, because I think by asserting that this application-based system is something that is welcome or appropriate really is a poor argument. What's also a poor argument is this equation with citizens' rights from the Conservative Party and the withdrawal agreement. Since the vote in June 2016, the Conservative Party, through all that time, could have brought forward primary legislation in itself that would have enshrined the rights of EU citizens in law. To bind it with the withdrawal agreement and the Brexit process, many EU citizens have argued was using them as a pawn in those negotiations. And that is deeply unfortunate. And that is why, to equate the politics of Brexit as a whole and bring the EU citizens' rights argument into questions about the withdrawal agreement, I believe is wrong. Alberto Costa, the Conservative MP before MP stood down for the election, has argued with, in the same principle as the Scottish Government for the enshrining of EU citizens' rights in law in itself. And I would encourage the Scottish Conservatives to listen to his arguments, because I think they're incredibly strong. Yes?
Adam Tompkins.
Very grateful to the Minister for giving way. He's been very generous with his time. Alberto Costa is a good friend of mine, as well as my parents' MP, or hopefully soon to be again MP. Is not the argument against that position, however, very simple, which is that we need to worry not only about the rights of EU nationals lawfully resident in the United Kingdom, we also need to worry equally about the rights of UK nationals living elsewhere in the EU. And there needs to be reciprocity in these arrangements. And that, for all of the will in the world, and no matter how we define parliamentary sovereignty, the UK Parliament cannot legislate for that.
Ben Macpherson.
The rights of British citizens elsewhere in the EU, I think, is incredibly important, and that's why I met with British in Europe to hear their perspectives. However, the UK government drew a red line when it came to these issues very early on in the Brexit process, and that was the really unforgivable mistake. The arguments from the Conservative benches about keeping an application-based system because we need a physical mechanism, as Jamie Green put it, I don't think that stands up either, because there's no need. A declarative system that has a registration process is still a mechanism. It's just very different from a constitutive applications process, which is what the EU settlement scheme is, where on the one hand, you declare people's rights and then there's a registration process thereafter in order to make sure the system administratively works well and effectively. But a constitutive application-based system that we have at the moment is asking people to apply for rights they already have, which, as many have said, is insulting and also degrading. And as Liam MacArthur said very eloquently, but also worryingly, an application system hangs a threat of deportation over EU citizens' heads. In terms of the motion, I think it's also important to touch on the aspect of pre-settled status, which a number of speakers picked up on. We really, I hope we'll be able to unite as a Parliament tonight to argue that the 5 years residency requirement for settled status really is nonsensical. It's part of the very bureaucratic process that Fulton McGregor talked about all the evidence that is required in order to go through the settled status process. There's no need, and I think it's completely unjustified to argue that people should have to have lived here for 5 years to demonstrate their contribution to our society. A pre-settled status is confusing and has a potential impact on a sense of two different classes of EU citizens, and we could do well without it. And just, if we're going to have a settled status scheme, let's make sure that everyone gets full settled status and all the rights that come with that. Annabel Ewing, I was grateful that she picked up on the point about physical proof. Not every EU citizen will want physical proof of settled status, but those that do should have the right to have it in order to have that reassurance, as they see it, of their status. And indeed, if citizens from out with the EU and the EEA and British citizens can have physical proof, then why should EU citizens be no different, particularly when, worryingly, as STVO have highlighted, but others have to me as well, where EU citizens are being asked to present their rights already to different agencies and organisations, shows that the electronic approach that the UK government have taken isn't working. The Conservative also picked up on also mentioned a number of points about what the UK government is doing with reference to their amendment. I'd just like to pick up on a number of them briefly. A number of the Conservative speakers talked about the agricultural worker scheme, and the Scottish Government welcomes the agricultural worker scheme, but it's simply inadequate for it to currently be at 2,500. But even an extension to 10,000 is inadequate, given the horticultural sector in the UK currently utilises for its economic productivity 60,000 migrant workers. So with the removal of freedom of movement and the reduced agricultural worker scheme, I don't see logically how that will support agricultural businesses here in Scotland and indeed across the UK. And while the NHS visa that's been proposed by the UK government does have some advantages in that they say it will be fast-tracked and the application fee will be half, this will be a poor substitute for freedom of movement and will still involve £1,000 from every employer in order to facilitate such an individual to come here, and will still be a much increased bureaucratic process compared with freedom of movement. Also on the Conservative amendment, and why we'll be voting against it, was the point around the brightest and the best. And this is a phrase that the UK government is using on a regular basis. And we in Scotland want to attract people who are highly qualified. That's why we've continually argued for the reintroduction of the post-study work visa, and we're glad to see that happen after 7 years of campaigning, but we'd like to see it implemented sooner. But I think this phrase, the brightest and the best, is unfortunate because it creates a hierarchy of skills. And actually, if you look at the wider enrichment that immigration brings to Scotland, for example, 16,000 health and social care workers, how does this phrase of the brightest and the best, which is giving a perception of highly qualified, highly paid individuals only being welcome in the UK, it doesn't capture the wider enrichment and importance of immigration to Scotland and indeed to the UK as a whole. And just lastly, in terms of the Conservative points, they talked about SNP policy in the White Paper of 2013. Let us be clear that we, yes, argued for a point system for out with the EEA, but the clear policy of that White Paper in 2013 was for Scotland to stay in the EU. And of course, that is what removal of our EU membership is now what we face, unfortunately, as being part of the UK. But I don't want to get too much into the constitutional question, because I want to focus this on EU citizens' rights, because that's what's most important today. In summing up, Presiding Officer, just finally, I would like to emphasise that the Stay in Scotland campaign is up and running. I would encourage members to use the materials. I would encourage members to encourage businesses, third sector organisations, other entities within their constituencies and regions to do all they can to encourage EU citizens to stay and to support them to do so. But also, I would encourage the Chamber to support the Labour amendment in the name of Claire Baker and then the government motion as amended to call on the UK government to move from this illogical, often harmful settled status scheme which requires application to a different approach where EU citizens' rights, EU citizens who contribute so much to our society and have done so much for the benefit of Scotland, to have their rights declared and secured in law and to not have to go through a humiliating application process. And if we are going to keep an EU settlement scheme, to at least get rid of the pre-settled status because it is unnecessary, and to give individuals the option of physical proof so that they can demonstrate their rights in that way if that's what they choose to do. Presiding Officer, EU citizens have made a huge contribution to our country. They continue to do so. So I ask Parliament to back the motion as amended by the Labour amendment. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Minister. That concludes our debate on protecting the rights of EU citizens. There are 3 questions to be put this evening. And I would remind members that if the amendment in the name of Donald Cameron is agreed, then the amendment in the name of Claire Baker will fall. So the first question is that amendment 19809.2 in the name of Donald Cameron, which seeks to amend motion 19809 in the name of Ben Macpherson on protecting the rights of EU citizens in Scotland, be agreed. Are we all agreed? No. We're not agreed. We'll move to a vote. Members may cast their votes now. The result of the vote on amendment number 19809.2 in the name of Donald Cameron is yes 22, no 71. There were no abstentions. The amendment is therefore not agreed. The next question is that amendment 19809.3 in the name of Claire Baker, which seeks to amend the motion in the name of Ben Macpherson, be agreed. Are we all agreed? We're not agreed. We'll move to a vote. Members may vote now. The result of the vote on amendment number 19809.3 in the name of Claire Baker is yes 71, no 22. There were no abstentions. The amendment is therefore agreed. And the final question is that motion 19809 in the name of Ben Macpherson as amended on protecting the rights of EU citizens in Scotland be agreed. Are we all agreed? Yes. We're not agreed. We'll move to a division. Members may cast their votes now. The result of the vote on motion 19809 in the name of Ben Macpherson as amended is yes 71, no 22. There were no abstentions. The motion as amended is therefore agreed. And that concludes decision time. We're going to move shortly to members' business in the name of Rachel Hamilton.
Well, it's lovely to be out on such a sunny evening in Edinburgh, but it's a shame that we have to be out tonight protesting against the two-child cap and the rate clause. Well more than a year since Alison Thulis, my colleague at Westminster, first spotted it in the small print of a Tory budget.
Very glad to see such a huge demonstration today and so many people still coming along 1 year after the rate clause came into force to show their opposition to this vile and despicable policy. The UK government have never been able to justify this policy, and we saw that this week with Esther McVeigh's pathetic attempts to say that the rate clause was somehow double support for women and that gives them some kind of chance to talk about the most appalling and disturbing experience of their life.
As you can see behind me, we're at the very beginning of the All Under One Banner rally. You can obviously hear the pipers behind me as events are about to kick off.
It's time to aim high, look resolutely outwards, and never, ever accept second best. Above all, it's time to believe that we can. We can build that better country we know is possible. And friends, we will.
If you enjoy watching our programmes, please help us to be Scotland's independent broadcaster by signing up to become a Broadcasting Scotland supporter.
Wherever you stand, get the fresh view of what's happening in Scotland with iScot. Celebrate everything about our country with intelligent, in-depth insight from lifestyle, culture to puzzles, and all the opinions you'll need. Whether it's digital or by post, subscribe now to iScot.